A quiet farmer stops to help a bleeding man lying on a dirt road. He thinks it's just the right thing to do. But 48 hours later, a convoy of 12 black SUVs rolls onto his property, and what they want changes everything. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The late spring sun cast its fading light across a narrow dirt road winding through fields of waist-high corn. Most folks in Brandlow County hardly use this route anymore, not since the newly paved highway gave them an easier path into town. But for 60-year-old Henry Cole, that old dirt road was an extension of his land, a place he knew as intimately as he knew each furrow of his fields and the squeak of the barn door at dawn. He drove his faded blue pickup slowly, scanning the rows of crops for any signs of pests or disease, his mind already on which section needed irrigation first thing in the morning. He'd planned to head straight to the farmhouse, fix a quick supper, and go over next week's seed orders. But then he caught a flicker of movement near the ditch. At first, he thought it might be a coyote lurking in the tall grass. A second look, though, revealed the shape of a man crumpled against the dusty bank. Henry's foot pressed the brake before he'd even formed a conscious thought. Living out here all his life had taught him that leaving a stranger in need was never an option. He pulled over, cut the engine, and reached behind the seat for his battered first aid kit. As he approached, he saw the man was in rough shape. A swollen eye, blood crusted along his hairline, clothes torn and dust-caked. The man stirred when Henry crouched beside him. "Sir?" Henry's voice was low and calm, the same tone he used around frightened animals. "You hurt bad?" One eye blinked open in confusion. It took a second for the stranger to focus on Henry's face. He tried to speak but coughed instead, bringing up a streak of red saliva. Alarmed, Henry set the kit down. "Easy now," he murmured. "Don't try to talk yet." Henry carefully checked for broken bones. The man flinched when Henry's fingers brushed his ribs, so Henry moved more gently. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said. But the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and Henry's old truck wasn't exactly equipped for medical transport. Still, it was the only option. The man's hand shot out and grabbed Henry's wrist. A surge of desperation glimmered in his good eye. "Don't. Hospital," he managed to rasp. Henry frowned. "You need help. I can't just leave you out here." "No hospital," the man insisted, voice trembling. The attempt to speak sent him into a fit of coughing again. Henry hesitated. He wasn't sure why this man was so adamant about avoiding medical care. But farmers learned early on how to handle emergencies with what they had on hand. "All right," he said gently, "but we can't stay here." With careful effort, Henry helped the injured man to his feet and guided him into the passenger seat of the truck. He placed a folded blanket behind him for support. Then he drove back toward his own property. The battered stranger kept drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing ragged. Henry's land was modest, 80 acres of fields, a dilapidated barn he tried his best to maintain, and a cozy farmhouse built by his grandfather decades ago. A few scattered outbuildings dotted the yard. He slowed the truck near the porch and slid out to help his passenger. As soon as Henry got him inside, the man nearly collapsed on the worn living room couch. Henry flicked on an old lamp, its yellow light casting soft shadows on the wood-paneled walls. "Let's get you cleaned up," he said, heading for the sink to fill a bowl with warm water. He rummaged through a cupboard for antiseptic and fresh bandages. His own mother had taught him the basics of first aid, back when the hospital was even farther, and he'd put those lessons to use more times than he'd ever wanted. The man's breathing calmed a bit as Henry washed the blood from his face. There was a cut on the temple, fairly deep but not hopeless, and multiple bruises. He guessed the man was in his late 30s or early 40s, though it was hard to tell through all the swelling. "Name's Henry Cole," he said quietly, dabbing at dried blood. "This place is mine." I'll patch you up, but I sure wish you'd let me call the doc." Henry expected no reply, but the man's lips parted slightly. "Jacob," he whispered, wincing at his own voice. Then he stopped, as if uncertain whether to say more. Henry pressed no further. It wasn't his habit to pry into a man's troubles. "All right, Jacob. Don't talk if it hurts. I'll do what I can." Henry cleaned the cuts, bandaged the swollen eye, and gingerly palpated the man's side. "Got some cracked ribs, I think. Need to rest. I'll get you some water." Jacob nodded weakly, relief and pain mingling on his bruised features. Henry brought him a glass of water, which he sipped in grateful silence. Something about him put Henry on edge. Perhaps the caution in his stare or the tension that never left his body, even when he was half unconscious. But Henry reminded himself that the man might just be scared. People showed fear in all kinds of ways. The hours crawled by. In the quiet hush of evening, Henry coaxed Jacob to eat a bit of soup and swallow a pain reliever from the first aid kit. When Jacob was settled, Henry finally let himself think about what he'd do next. Maybe in the morning, if Jacob's condition improved, Henry could drive him to Doc Halpern in town. If Jacob still refused, Henry would have to figure out some other safe approach. He wasn't a man to walk away from a person in need. Exhausted, Henry sank into his old recliner and dozed off, the lamp still glowing faintly. He woke hours later to the sound of the wind rattling the windows. The clock on the wall read 3:12 a.m. He glanced over to see Jacob sleeping fitfully, sweat dampening his brow. Henry got up to fetch a cool cloth. That was when he noticed headlights sweeping across the yard outside. It wasn't unusual for folks around here to pull in at odd hours if they needed help, but the pattern of those lights made Henry uneasy. They cut out suddenly, as though the driver had realized the house was occupied. Henry crept to the window. He saw a black SUV at the end of his driveway, idling with no lights now. He couldn't make out the license plate. It lingered for a solid minute, then slowly backed away and disappeared down the road. Henry's gut tightened. He didn't like the feeling of that. Most neighbors had vehicles he recognized. Battered pickups, older sedans. A black SUV creeping around after midnight was not typical in these parts. He glanced at Jacob, who hadn't stirred, then returned to his seat. He told himself it might be lost travelers, or maybe a car with mechanical trouble. Still, it kept him awake until dawn. By morning, Jacob's feverish restlessness had eased. He managed to push himself upright against the cushions. Henry set a cup of warm tea on the table beside him. "I saw a vehicle last night," Henry said softly, watching for Jacob's reaction. "Didn't look like it belonged around here. Seemed to be looking for something." Jacob's eyes flicked up, and a flash of fear crossed his face before he managed to mask it. Henry said nothing more, just studied him for a moment. "If you're in trouble, son, best let me know what I'm dealing with." Jacob opened his mouth, then pressed his lips shut. He took a sip of tea before speaking in a weary tone. I was on my way through the county," he said. "Ran into some problems. People after me." Henry exhaled, unsurprised. "Don't guess they're real friendly?" Jacob shook his head. "Not friendly at all." He coughed, pressing a hand to his ribs. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." Henry's voice was kind. "I'm not about to leave you to fend for yourself, but you better believe I'm not letting any trouble harm this place." He paused, crossing his arms. "What is it they want with you?" Jacob hesitated, then sighed. "I didn't do what they asked. I have information, something that could get them in legal trouble. They tried to keep me quiet. I got away." His gaze dropped to the bandages on his arms. "Barely." Henry's mind whirled with the kind of predicament that could spur men to violence. In his heart, he felt he couldn't just turn this stranger out. But if these people tracked Jacob here... Henry clenched his jaw. He'd built his life on these acres, and he was proud of how he ran them. With honesty, with hard work, and with a hand always extended to those in need. This was no time to waver. "All right," he said. "We'll figure it out. Right now you need rest." That first day passed in tense quiet. Henry went about his chores, milking the goats, checking the irrigation ditches, feeding the livestock. Every now and then, he'd peer down the long gravel drive, half expecting to see that black SUV. But no one came. When he returned inside, he found Jacob asleep, though uneasy. On the second morning, Henry rose before sunrise as usual. He poured coffee into a battered thermos, then checked on Jacob. The man was more alert, though still aching. Henry showed him where the bathroom was, handed him a spare shirt. Jacob managed a faint smile of gratitude. Yet even with the small pleasantries, something simmered under the surface, a sense of watchfulness and dread. Later, Henry took the pickup to gather supplies. The trip to the local feed store was uneventful, but he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. His reflection in the store's glass window revealed a worry line deepening on his brow. He grabbed extra feed, spare parts for the tractor, a couple of new lock hinges. The notion of reinforcing doors and gates nudged its way into his thoughts. Back home, nothing seemed amiss. Jacob tried to help carry a sack, wincing at the strain. "Take it easy," Henry scolded gently. "You're still mending." He studied the quiet road stretching from the fence to the horizon. This time of year, the farmland was usually so peaceful. He never locked the door in daylight, never had to. But at that moment, he gave the old latch a once-over and frowned at how flimsy it looked. 2 days had passed since Henry found Jacob, and that afternoon, as the sun beat down on the fields, Henry and Jacob sat on the porch. Jacob had insisted on coming outside, saying the fresh air helped him think. Henry sipped iced tea while Jacob gingerly held a compress to his ribs. The squeak of the rocking chair was the only sound for a few minutes. Then came a low rumble of engines. At first, Henry assumed it was a neighbor's tractor, but it grew louder, much louder, and the tension in Jacob's posture told Henry this was no casual approach. A glance at the top of the dirt road made Henry's heart lurch. 1, 2, 3. A total of 12 shiny black SUVs emerged, each spaced evenly behind the other. They resembled a convoy of ominous beetles creeping across the farmland, raising a cloud of dust behind them. Henry set his glass down firmly. "Stay inside," he told Jacob. "Lock the door. No matter what happens, you don't come out." Jacob's eyes widened, but he nodded. He could scarcely stand without support, so Henry steeled himself for what might come next. He walked out into the yard, every nerve alive with worry. The SUVs fanned out in a semicircle near the barn, engines still idling. Doors opened. Men in dark suits stepped out, far too many for Henry to count at once. Some wore sunglasses despite the direct glare of the midday sun. A tall figure advanced, posture stiff with authority, scanning the property like he owned it. Henry forced himself to remain calm. "Afternoon," he said in a level tone. "Help you folks with something." The tall man inclined his head, an expression of polite mockery on his face. "We're looking for someone," he replied. "He was hurt, and we have reason to believe he might have come this way." The man's voice was smooth, but there was a steely edge undercutting it. Henry had no trouble recognizing a threat when he heard one. "Only folks here are me and my goats," Henry responded. He spread his hands in a nonchalant gesture. "You're welcome to have a look around, but I can't say you'll find anything interesting." A flicker of frustration rippled across the stranger's face. He glanced back at the men behind him, who began to fan out across the yard. Henry's gut churned. He had to keep them away from the house at all costs, and from Jacob, who likely couldn't defend himself in his current state. Henry's mind raced. He was no fighter, just a farmer who refused to give in to bullies, but he also knew these men likely carried guns beneath those expensive jackets. The tall man smiled thinly. "We'll look around," he said. I appreciate your cooperation." Henry clenched his jaw. The second those men started roaming, they'd find footprints or rummage through his house. He couldn't let them do that unchallenged. But there were a dozen of them at least. Maybe more. Yet Henry felt an unshakable sense of duty. Jacob might have made some mistakes or crossed dangerous people, but Henry was not about to betray a man he'd rescued. "All I ask," Henry said, voice steady, "is that you don't trample my corn. That's my livelihood." He locked eyes with the stranger, each reading the other's intentions. This was the moment that would decide how far they'd go. Henry's pulse thudded in his ears, but he refused to show fear. If these men wanted a confrontation, they'd get one. And Henry would fight with everything he had to protect his home and whoever was inside. "Of course," the tall man said softly. "We'd hate to damage your property." Then he gestured. The others began advancing, scanning the outbuildings with cold efficiency. The day's heat pressed down, thick and stifling. Henry stood his ground. The first steps of a dangerous dance had begun, and there was no telling who would emerge unscathed. The crisp morning air smelled of dust and sun-baked crops as Henry Cole stood firm in his yard, eyes tracking the group of black-suited men dispersing onto his property. He felt his pulse jump each time one of them stepped closer to the house. Though his heart hammered, he maintained a calm veneer. This was his land, and he was determined to protect it. The tall man who'd spoken first lingered near the front bumper of an SUV. He watched Henry with a kind of detached amusement, as if weighing how much of a threat this graying farmer posed. Two men peeled off from the rest and headed straight for the side of the barn, ignoring the squeak of the gate or the way the dried weeds crackled under their shoes. Henry wanted to yell for them to stop, but he swallowed the impulse. It wouldn't do any good to provoke them, at least not yet. Inside the house, Jacob hovered just behind the door, fighting both pain and fear. He could hear snatches of conversation through a gap in the old wood. Every footstep outside sounded like a thunderclap. He steeled himself against panic. If these men found him, there was no telling what might happen, or what might happen to Henry, whose only wrongdoing had been a simple act of compassion. Jacob braced his hand against the wall, feeling the slight tremble in his bruised ribs, and forced himself to breathe evenly. Outside, Henry noticed one of the men wandering closer to the porch. He was stocky, with a neatly trimmed beard and a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his face. Henry made a point of sidestepping to intercept him. "I told you you're welcome to look around," he said, voice carrying more authority than he felt. "But I'd be grateful if you asked before stepping inside my home." The man gave a shrug that might have been meant as an apology. "We won't damage anything," he said, yet his smirk suggested he cared little for permission. Still, he paused. The tall man finally strode forward, scanning the peeling paint on the farmhouse and the sagging roofline, as if none of it impressed him in the slightest. "We have reason to believe you're harboring someone," he said, his voice carrying that same polished tone. "If you cooperate, we'll be on our way soon enough." Henry met the stranger's gaze. "I don't harbor anyone," he said pointedly. "And I don't lie. This is my place, and I'll ask you again not to disturb more than you need to." "Understood," the man said, though his tone was curt. He raised a hand to the others, and they spread out even wider. A few seemed to be scanning the cornfields, as if expecting a figure to bolt at any second. One man peered through the barn's open door, but the interior was shadowy, containing only old equipment and a pair of goats rummaging for stray bits of hay. Henry's mind flicked back to the prior night. Those headlights on the road must have been a scout, or a tail. Perhaps they'd traced Jacob's trail to this farm. The thought made Henry's jaw tighten with anger. The entire county knew Henry Cole was a law-abiding sort. And yet, here were these men, likely criminals themselves, seeking to trample his rights for the sake of capturing a wounded man. Jacob's wounded, Henry reminded himself. Not only was he battered, but he had information these men desperately wanted to bury. That was the only explanation for such a coordinated show of force. Henry noticed a few vehicles creeping around the perimeter, raising dust as they circled like prowling cats. He bit back the urge to stride over and tear the keys from those ignitions. Finally, the tall man turned back to Henry. "I'm afraid we'll need to check inside the house," he said, pressing a forced civility into his words. "We can do this politely or—" Henry cut him off. "I know my rights," he said firmly. "You got a warrant? I don't see any badges or official paperwork." He swept his gaze pointedly over the men. Their suits were crisp, but they had no markings, no insignia. Definitely not law enforcement. So unless you can show me something legal, I'd prefer you keep out of my living room. The tall man's jaw flexed. He exhaled through his nose. "We're not law enforcement," he conceded. "But we do have, let's say, authority to retrieve what's ours." He gestured to two men who were lingering near the porch. "We won't damage your home, but we are going in." Henry shifted his stance, heart lurching. He thought about the old hunting rifle tucked away in his closet, the one that hadn't been fired in years. But a quick glance at the men's expressions told him they would respond with overwhelming violence if he tried to fight them head-on. Besides, the last thing Henry wanted was bullets flying around a wooden house, especially with Jacob inside. "Let me go in first," Henry proposed, trying to mask the anxiety in his voice. "I'll show you there's no one there. That's enough, isn't it?" "It's not," said the tall man, stepping closer. He took off his sunglasses, revealing cold eyes. "We will look for ourselves, unless you'd rather be forced out of the way." 100 thoughts flashed through Henry's mind. If these men marched in, they'd see Jacob. Could Jacob even hide effectively in his condition? Henry had to find a way to stall or distract them. Anything to buy Jacob a chance. He cleared his throat. "I guess you leave me no choice," he muttered. "But do it quickly, and if you harm a single piece of furniture, you can forget about me standing aside." A flicker of amusement crossed the man's face. "We'll be quick." He motioned to the two by the porch. "Check inside. Keep it neat." Henry watched them ascend the steps. One tried the handle, found it locked. Henry fished in his pocket for the key, hoping that tiny delay might help. He handed it over slowly. The men pushed inside. Henry's chest tightened. He remained in the yard, clenching and unclenching his fists, praying that Jacob understood. The plan, if it could be called that, was for Jacob to slip into the cellar or find some nook behind the pantry, wherever he could remain unseen. Henry tried not to imagine the confrontation if the men discovered him. Cowering behind the couch, the tall man surveyed Henry's worried features. "Why are you still out here?" he asked, nearly mocking. "You're sure you don't want to follow them? And sure they don't knock over any lamps?" Henry forced a dry chuckle. "I'd rather not see how you folks rifle through my private things. I'll wait." His heart hammered, but he managed a veneer of calm. "Though if you're so certain there's a fugitive on my property, I suppose you've come prepared for trouble." "Trouble's only for those who don't cooperate," the man said, then paused as a few more of his own started edging along the side of the house. Henry fought the urge to call out. He could do little but watch, furious at how these strangers trespassed. The farmland had always been a refuge for him, a place where locked doors were seldom necessary. Now it felt violated. Inside the house, Jacob crouched in the small space behind the pantry shelves, every breath sending pain lancing through his ribs. He could hear footsteps, muffled curses, the thud of cabinet doors being opened and slammed shut. For a moment, he thought he'd be discovered, when a voice muttered dangerously close. But then it receded, boots pounding toward the back hall. Jacob closed his eyes, sweat beading on his forehead. He pressed his palm flat against the plank wall, as if anchoring himself to the old house. Just a little longer, he thought, desperation thrumming in his veins. Just don't come in here. Outside, Henry tried to keep track of how many men had gone inside, how many roamed the yard. The large group by the barn had scattered, looking behind bales of hay, rummaging near the goat pen, or peering into the feed shack. It grated on Henry's nerves, but he wasn't foolish enough to start a confrontation when they had the advantage. It felt like an eternity. Finally, the two men emerged from the house, stepping back onto the porch. They exchanged a glance with the tall man and shook their heads. Nothing. Henry's entire body sagged with relief, though he tried to hide it. That meant Jacob hadn't been found, at least not yet. But the men didn't look entirely convinced. One of them said, "He's not in there, unless there's some trap door or attic space we missed." "Check for both," snapped the tall man, clearly losing patience. Henry heard his own voice coming out in a scolding tone. "There is no attic, and if you break any boards looking for a basement that doesn't exist, you'll pay for the damage. I told you wouldn't find anyone." The tall man turned slowly, his expression razor-sharp. "Is that so?" His eyes pinned Henry. "Because we have reason to believe he is here, hiding. That means you'd be lying, Mr. Cole." Henry stiffened. "I'm no liar. You men have had your look. You're free to check the fields. Though I'd prefer you not crush half my crops. Beyond that, I'll ask you to be on your way." A tense silence passed. Henry half expected the man to order a violent search, tearing up the farm. Instead, the group by the barn came back around offering silent shrugs. No sign of anyone. The tall man closed his eyes for a second, looking deeply displeased. He seemed to be weighing whether to force the issue further. "All right," he muttered finally. "We'll search the fields. After that, we go." He nodded at the men. One by one, they filed back into their SUVs. A few disembarked to fan out along the rows of corn. Henry followed at a distance, making certain they didn't crush the young stalks or the irrigation lines underfoot. He heard them muttering to each other, discussing how the farm was big and would take time to search thoroughly. Henry had spent his entire life studying these fields. He knew every dip, every patch of looser soil, every drainage channel. He suspected these men might try to linger. They would want to confirm their target wasn't hiding among the towering plants. So Henry guided them carefully, keeping them away from the house, reasoning that if Jacob needed to slip out for any reason, he'd have a clear path. Yet Jacob wouldn't get far with those ribs, unless it was absolutely necessary. Over an hour later, the men returned, dusty and irritable. No sign of the fugitive. Henry forced a casual shrug. "Told you so," he said quietly, though his heart still pounded. "Now, can I have my farm back, or do I need to fetch the county sheriff?" The tall man's nostrils flared. "We'll leave," he said at last, voice ice-cold. "But if we discover you've lied, Mr. Cole—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Henry read the threat clearly in the man's gaze. "Have a safe drive," Henry replied, not breaking eye contact. One by one, the SUVs revved their engines, then rolled out of the yard. The dust hung in the air for a long time. Only when the last vehicle disappeared beyond the turn did Henry exhale, shoulders slumping. He hurried inside. "Jacob!" His voice echoed in the silent living room. Panic flared. Had Jacob tried to escape or move somewhere else? Then Jacob emerged from the pantry area, wincing. His face was pale. "I heard them leave," he said, sounding close to collapse. I didn't think there were so many." His body shook with an unsteady adrenaline crash. Henry helped him to the couch. "Easy, son," he murmured, passing him a glass of water. Jacob drank greedily, coughing at the end. "They turned this place upside down, but they didn't find you. Let's hope they don't come back." Jacob's eyes glittered with gratitude and guilt. "You've risked everything for me." "I never meant—" Henry held up a hand. "Stop. If I did what they wanted, I'd be no better than they are. You're hurt. I'm not in the habit of abandoning folks in trouble." Jacob shut his eyes, emotions roiling. He had no illusions about the kind of men who'd just shown up. They wouldn't simply give up. "I need to find a way out of here," he whispered. "I can't put you in more danger." Henry frowned, crossing his arms. "Where would you go? You can hardly walk straight, let alone outrun them." "I have contacts," Jacob muttered. "But I need a phone, or I need a ride far enough so I can vanish." Henry considered the phone in the kitchen. It was just a landline, and if these men had the means, they might be monitoring calls. He didn't know the extent of their power, but from their numbers alone, it seemed extensive. "We'll figure something out," Henry said. "But first, you rest. If they come back, they'll find me the same as they did before. Uncooperative." Jacob shook his head, voice strained. "They could kill you, Henry. These people, they're capable of anything." Silence hung in the air. Henry recognized the fear in Jacob's tone, yet the farmer's sense of decency wouldn't allow him to do otherwise. "I won't hand a man over to be killed," he said at last. "Now hush. Let me think." He paced across the threadbare rug, mind churning. The local sheriff was a decent man, but if these folks had the resources to roam about in a convoy of shiny SUVs, they might be able to buy off small-town law or make it vanish. Henry had no desire to place the sheriff in danger either. Yet, Henry couldn't face them alone if they returned in force. Perhaps there was a friend or two he could trust. He wondered if he should quietly call Frank Adams, a retired Army buddy who lived 2 counties over, or maybe approach the neighbor who kept a shortwave radio. The trouble was how quickly those men had found the farm in the first place. It meant they were organized and determined. Jacob sensed Henry's turmoil. "Maybe I'll slip out tonight," he murmured. "I can hobble across the fields, find the next bus station. They won't trace me back here." Henry turned sharply. "No, I'm not sending you off broken and battered. You'd never make it far." He paused, considering. "We might need a safer hiding spot. Maybe in my barn's old cellar. It's hidden under the floor. We kept produce down there once upon a time." Jacob's expression flickered with hope. "That could work. At least until I'm strong enough to travel." Henry nodded, relieved to have a plan forming. He reached for Jacob's arm. "Let's get you settled. We'll gather what supplies we can. If they come back, we'll be ready." Though the hush of midday rested over the fields, both men felt the weight of looming danger. They moved carefully, every small sound seeming too loud. Down in the barn cellar, Henry helped Jacob situate himself on an old cot. The space smelled of earth and straw, with only a single lantern to chase away the dimness. For the first time since Henry had found him on the roadside, Jacob looked almost safe. But both of them knew the reprieve might be short-lived. If the men returned, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. Even the quiet farmland couldn't keep secrets forever. And Henry, though determined, had to wonder what it would cost him, and possibly everyone around him, to protect this stranger. Frank turned to Henry, eyes dark with worry. "We made it through tonight, but they'll be back soon, maybe with more men. They might even try to come at us from multiple angles." He paused, scanning the moonlit farmland. "We can't hold them off forever." Henry's pulse was still hammering from the brief altercation. "I know," he whispered. "But how do we spirit Jacob away without them noticing?" Frank rubbed the back of his neck. "I have an idea. Tomorrow we can do a recon drive around the area, see if there are watchers posted on the roads. If we find a gap, we pick a time, preferably after sundown, load Jacob into my sedan, and head straight out of Branlow County. But we'll need a diversion to keep them guessing." Henry glanced back at the barn, that old wooden structure now safeguarding a man whose troubles had become his own. "What sort of diversion?" he asked. "I'm no soldier, Frank." Frank gave him a tight smile. "Sometimes a simple tactic can work. Maybe we start the tractor and drive it down the dirt road, making some noise while you or I sneak Jacob out in the other direction. Or we set up a decoy vehicle. Something that draws their attention, so they think we're heading north while we actually slip south. Henry frowned. I don't like lying, but I like less the thought of them storming this place again. He pressed a hand to his temple. Let's talk details inside. In the warm glow of the living room lamp, they sketched out a rudimentary plan on a scrap of paper. Frank insisted on traveling several side roads the next day to see if the black SUVs were still skulking around. If so, they'd track patterns of movement, identify where watchers might camp. Meanwhile, Henry would gather supplies for Jacob. A heavier coat, some rations, a first aid kit to manage pain during the trip. They talked in low voices, mindful of the hush surrounding them. Occasionally, Henry's gaze drifted to the window. He pictured those men regrouping, maybe placing calls for reinforcements. The memory of that intruder's hateful glare still set his nerves on edge. Finally, they agreed to try for the following night, if conditions allowed. Having a plan brought Henry limited relief. The sense of precariousness wouldn't vanish, not when each shadow outside could conceal a threat. He offered Frank a fold-out cot in the den, though neither man expected to sleep long. Exhaustion eventually claimed them. Henry dozed off to the ticking of the old clock, imagining footsteps scuffing the porch at every creak of the wind. When the rooster crowed at first light, Henry woke, feeling wrung out. He rubbed his stiff neck, then found Frank sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, scanning a county map. "Morning," Frank said quietly. "Figured I'd get started with the route planning. If we slip out to the west, we can maybe avoid main roads. We'll see." Henry nodded and poured his own cup of coffee. He thought about Jacob, wondered if he'd slept at all in that dank cellar. A pang of guilt flickered. Was this truly the best they could do for him? "I'll check on Jacob," he told Frank. "Then maybe I'll ride with you to scout. We can pass off the drive as normal farm errands." Frank agreed, so Henry carried a small breakfast of biscuits and leftover beans to the barn. He made sure to scan the horizon first. No unusual vehicles glinted in the early sunlight. He tapped lightly on the barn door before entering, calling Jacob's name. The cellar hatch opened from inside, and Jacob peered out, looking pale but awake. "All clear?" Henry handed him the plate of food. "As far as I can tell. How you feeling?" Jacob gave a shaky shrug. "Better than yesterday. The throbbing in my ribs hasn't gone away, but I can move without passing out. Thanks for everything." Henry only nodded. "My friend Frank is here, ex-military. We have a plan to get you out, possibly by tomorrow night. He's going to scout for watchers. With luck, we'll slip past them." Jacob exhaled. "That's good. If I can reach a safe place, I'll contact the people who can expose all this. I might need to pass them the evidence I stashed." Henry's brow furrowed. "How much do you trust them?" Jacob's gaze flickered. "Enough. They want justice, not hush money." Satisfied, Henry left him to eat and returned to the house. Frank was already outside, loading items into his sedan, a battered vehicle that looked like it had been through desert roads. Henry joined him, carrying a small cooler. "We can claim we're picking up feed and supplies," Henry suggested. Frank nodded. "Yes, keep it casual. If we see any suspicious vehicles, we note them and move on." They climbed in and set off along the dirt lane. The ride felt strangely tense, even though the morning sun shone bright and farmland stretched peacefully on both sides. Henry kept his eyes on every bend, scanning for hidden watchers. They passed a cluster of oak trees, then a lone mailbox, but encountered no one. Eventually, the dirt lane joined the county highway. Frank guided the sedan onto smoother asphalt, picking up speed. "We'll circle the outskirts of town first," he said. "See if we spot any black SUVs parked or idling." Henry's stomach fluttered with nerves as they cruised past the feed store and the diner. He recognized a few local trucks, some neighbors heading to the co-op, but no sign of the men. They pressed on, skirting residential streets. The day was still early enough that few people were out. They drove another mile toward the industrial edge of town, where a row of warehouses stood. Suddenly, Henry spotted something that made his heart skip. A black SUV parked near a fenced lot. The windows were tinted, though it could belong to anyone. Frank slowed slightly, eyes narrowed. "Could be them," he muttered. They didn't stop, merely took note of the license plate. The vehicle's occupant, if present, didn't show himself. Henry tried not to stare too long. Frank continued, turning onto a side street, eventually swinging back into farmland. They encountered one more black SUV along the quiet roads, parked near a motel with out-of-state plates. Again, no direct confrontation, just the uneasy sense of being watched. After about 2 hours of this surveillance, Frank exhaled. "Well, I count at least 2 vehicles that might belong to them. They're probably setting up vantage points waiting to see if Jacob appears. Maybe they suspect we'll try to flee. So we'll need to be extra careful leaving." Henry nodded, knuckles tight on his seat. "I hate this," he muttered. "Feels like we're being hunted." Back at the farm, they parked around the back to avoid drawing attention. Henry squinted at the bright midday sun. The temperature had risen and sweat beaded on his brow. "What now?" Frank hopped out, scanning the quiet acreage. "We get ready. If we're leaving tonight, we gather everything Jacob needs, plus a backup plan in case we're intercepted." They set to work. Frank cleaned and inspected the pistol he'd taken from the intruder the previous night, though neither man wanted to rely on gunfire. Henry packed a canvas bag of water, non-perishable food, and bandages. He also grabbed a small wad of cash from his emergency jar. If Jacob needed a motel or bribes along the way, best be prepared. As afternoon wore on, tension simmered beneath each chore. Henry fed the goats, fixed a broken latch on the barn door, and hauled more feed out of sight, anything to keep his hands busy. Meanwhile, Frank quietly tested the sedan's engine, ensuring it was in good shape for a long drive. Every so often they exchanged a glance, each man thinking the same thought. If those men arrive again, how far will this escalate? When twilight finally came, they gathered in the living room one last time. Jacob, moving gingerly, joined them. His face was set with determination, despite the bruises. Frank spread the map on the table. "We'll head west along this unmarked road," he explained, tracing a line with his finger. "It's gravel. Might be rough, but fewer eyes. Once we're past Willow Creek, we link up with the highway." Jacob studied the route. "Will you come all the way?" he asked Frank, voice hesitant. "I don't want to drag you both into danger if they follow." Henry answered before Frank could. "You're not going alone. We'll drive you as far as you need. The only question is if I should stay and protect the farm while Frank goes with you." Frank frowned. "If you stay alone, Henry, you're vulnerable." Henry swallowed. "I know. But if the whole farm is empty, they might think we've all fled and burn it down in anger. This land is my life. I can't just walk away." A heavy silence fell. Jacob lowered his eyes. "I never wanted to cause that kind of threat to your home. This is my fault." Henry shook his head. "It's theirs, not yours." Finally, Frank spoke. "We compromise. I'll drive Jacob out, at least through the next county, ensure we lose any pursuers. Then I double back under cover of darkness and return to help Henry. That way Jacob gets clear and Henry won't be alone for too long." They agreed to try that. Night settled deeper, the sky studded with stars. They readied the sedan, loading supplies in the trunk with quiet efficiency. Henry gave Jacob one of his thick denim jackets. Jacob nodded in gratitude, grimacing slightly as he slid it over tender ribs. At last, everything was set. The plan was to slip away close to midnight, trusting that any watchers might be lulled by the late hour. Henry and Frank exchanged a determined nod. They parted ways, Jacob resting one last time in the cellar, Henry quietly waiting for the appointed hour. As midnight approached, Henry and Frank helped Jacob hobble to the sedan. They kept the lights off, rolling slowly down the long drive, hoping to avoid notice. Henry stood in the driveway, heart pounding, as he watched them vanish into the darkness, the car's headlights off for the first half-mile. He felt a pang in his chest. Jacob was effectively a stranger, yet Henry had risked everything to shield him. Now all Henry could do was pray they'd slip the watchers. He returned to the porch, forced himself to sit, eyes alert. The barn's silhouette rose black against the faint moon glow. Inside, the goats rustled occasionally. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. A whip poor will called in the distance. Henry clenched his jaw, wondering if Frank and Jacob had made it clear. Eventually, a faint engine hum broke the silence. Henry tensed. Was it Frank returning, or someone else? He reached for the old hunting rifle he'd propped by the door, just in case. Flicking the porch light off, he peered across the yard. A single set of headlights emerged, drawing closer. The shape of the battered sedan came into view. Henry exhaled in relief, stepping onto the dirt to wave Frank in. The sedan pulled up and Frank climbed out, looking drained but unharmed. "We got away clean," he reported, voice low. "No sign of pursuit. I dropped him near a safe spot in the next county where he'll meet his contact. Figured that was best. I circled back carefully, changed routes, made sure I wasn't tailed." Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So he's free?" Frank nodded. "For now, yes, but that might not stop them from returning here to vent their anger. They'll suspect you helped him." Henry pushed a hand through his hair, exhausted and relieved in equal measure. "I'll handle what comes. I couldn't abandon the man." They stood in the darkness, each wrapped in his own thoughts. The farmland stretched in silent vigil, a place that once felt safe and isolated, now marked by the shadow of a distant, powerful threat. Frank patted Henry's shoulder. "You did good. Maybe they'll move on now that Jacob's gone. Realize they lost. But we should stay cautious. I can hang around a couple more days, help you keep watch." Henry nodded and for the first time in days felt a glimmer of hope. Frank stayed, just as he'd promised, and the next morning they found themselves side by side in Henry's modest kitchen. The heaviness of the past few days lingered, but with Jacob gone, it felt as if a small knot of tension had loosened in Henry's chest. It was a guarded relief, for he knew those men could still show up, demanding answers. Over eggs and toast, Frank leaned forward on his elbows. "We should keep an eye on the roads again today," he said. "Even though Jacob's out of the picture, there's a chance they'll come by, looking for retaliation or clues." Henry nodded, rinsing his mug in the sink. "I can't bear the thought of them stomping around my land again," he muttered. "I just hope they realize they lost and move on." But hoping they both knew wouldn't make it so. Henry stepped outside to begin his chores, leaving Frank to tidy up. The farm's routine felt oddly comforting after the swirl of recent days. He fed the goats, checked the trough, and walked the perimeter of his fields, still half expecting to spot Suits skulking among the rows. Yet all he saw were rustling leaves in the gentle breeze. For a fleeting moment, the farmland seemed to return to its usual peaceful state. He'd nearly completed his morning round when he saw Frank emerge from the house. Even from a distance, Henry noticed the set of Frank's shoulders, tense and alert. Frank lifted a hand in greeting, then beckoned Henry closer. "Something on the radio," Frank said once Henry was within earshot. "I've been monitoring a couple of frequencies. Sounded like chatter between vehicles, but it was real brief." Henry's gut tightened. Could it be them? "Could be." Frank exhaled. "They mentioned a route near Route 19. Not sure if that's related, but better we know than not." Henry chewed the inside of his cheek. Route 19 was only about 15 minutes away, a narrower highway that cut across farmland. "Let's take a quick drive," Henry suggested, "like we did yesterday. We'll loop around and see if there's any sign of them." They set off in Frank's battered sedan again, moving carefully down the dirt lane. They passed the neighbors' properties. No black SUVs in sight. When they turned onto the county highway, traffic was sparse, mostly local trucks with bales of hay. A few miles on, they spotted a familiar shape parked near an abandoned rest stop. One of those black SUVs, tinted windows, no front license plate. Frank slowed. "I count 2 men in the front seat," he said quietly. "Hard to see details." Henry's hands clenched on his knees. "Should we keep going?" Frank nodded, driving past at a modest speed. He didn't so much as glance toward the SUV, though his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The occupant in the passenger seat seemed to watch them roll by, but didn't follow. Once out of sight, Frank let out a breath. They might just be waiting for any sign of Jacob. At least they don't appear to be launching an assault. Henry's heart pounded. "I don't like that they're still here. Who knows how many more are around?" They pressed on, circling back through side roads. Twice Henry thought he glimpsed the same black SUV far behind them, but it never moved closer. By the time they returned to the farm, the morning sun was climbing high. Henry parked the sedan behind the barn to keep it out of direct view from the road. Inside, Henry locked the front door, a habit he never thought he'd need in these parts. It felt like he was barricading his life against a threat he still barely understood. Frank studied him. "You all right? You look rattled." Henry swallowed. "I just hate feeling like a prisoner on my own land." He shook his head. "But it beats living with guilt if I'd turn Jacob over to those thugs." Frank patted Henry's shoulder gently. "You did what was right, Henry. Now we just manage the consequences." He glanced around the tidy living room. "Let's make sure we're ready for any confrontation. If they do come, we can't be caught off guard." Henry agreed. They spent the next few hours reinforcing doors and windows with whatever scraps Henry had in the workshop. They replaced flimsy hinges, drove extra nails, and even propped a stout board behind the barn's side door to jam it from inside. It was hardly a fortress, but at least they could slow intruders down. Meanwhile, Frank walked the perimeter, verifying the lines they'd strung up before. A few spots needed adjusting where the breeze had tangled them. At midday, Henry fired up the old propane stove and heated a simple stew. He offered Frank a bowl, and they ate at the table in companionable silence. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the heat, and a crow perched on the fence. It was one of those slow, hot days that normally lulled Henry into calm acceptance of farm life, yet the tension in the air refused to abate. After lunch, Frank said he needed to step into town briefly for supplies. A few extra items for home security, as he put it. Henry stayed behind, watering the garden and checking the goats. He forced himself to think of everyday tasks, though his mind kept drifting to the possibility of confrontation. Every distant engine rumble made him glance up nervously. He was stooped by the goat pen when he heard a vehicle approach. His pulse spiked, but he recognized the rattle of an aging pickup. Standing upright, he saw his neighbor, Winston Old Win Fletcher, pulling up, a bale of straw in the bed. Win was a friend, though not a particularly close one. He mostly stuck to his own fields and didn't pry. But Henry worried about what Win might have heard from the grapevine. "Hey there, Henry," Win called, hopping out. He was a lean man in his 60s, a bit stooped from arthritis. "Thought I'd drop by, see if you're doing all right. Heard some folks saw strange cars near your place the other day." Henry forced a smile. "Afternoon, Win. I'm fine, thanks. How's your farm faring?" Win scratched his chin, gaze drifting. "Corn's doing all right, but I keep hearing about black SUVs prowling. Some folks say it's a private security outfit doing who knows what." He gave Henry a pointed look. "Figured you might know something. Word is they were snooping around your yard." Henry's stomach twisted. He hated to lie to a neighbor. "They did show up," he admitted. "Claimed they were looking for a missing person. But they haven't caused more trouble since." Win's eyes narrowed. "You sure you're okay? I can gather a few of the local boys if you need help." His tone hinted at firearms and tough talk, but Henry shook his head gently. I appreciate it, but let's not stir a hornet's nest. If they come again, I'll ask the sheriff for an escort. Wouldn't want any of you getting tangled in something nasty." Wynne studied Henry for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but don't hesitate to holler if you need an extra pair of eyes." He offered Henry a small container of fresh eggs from his coop. "For you," he said, a neighborly gesture. Henry thanked him. He watched Wynne drive off, feeling both gratitude and dread. The more folks in the county got curious, the more risk that these men would escalate. Henry half expected them to show up that afternoon, but the hours stretched on quietly. Frank returned from town with a duffel bag of supplies, extra flashlights, a crowbar, a box of nails, and they spent the late afternoon reinforcing the barn's loft hatch. As dusk settled, Henry found himself sitting on the porch swing. His gaze traveled the driveway, though no dust clouds signaled an approach. Frank joined him, sipping water from a canteen. For a while, neither spoke, lulled by the rhythmic chirp of crickets. Finally, Henry voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. "Frank, you think there's a chance they'll just leave? Pack it up and go now that Jacob's gone." Frank pursed his lips. "Possibly. But from what I've seen, these are relentless people. They might want to confirm you don't know anything else. Could be they suspect Jacob told you things." He paused, letting that sink in. "They might come back to interrogate you, or just punish you for helping him." Henry swallowed, the thought of that cold vengeance twisting his gut. "Well, let them come," he said shakily, though his heart pounded. "I won't cooperate." That night, Henry barely slept. He paced between windows, scanning the yard. The hours crawled by without incident, leaving him relieved, yet still uneasy. The next morning he found Frank already up, rummaging in the garage for wire clamps. "Couldn't sleep," Frank said, rubbing bloodshot eyes. "Figured I'd keep busy." Henry joined him in silence. They were both on edge, waiting for something. The day dragged on similarly to the last. Henry tended the farm, Frank hovered near the house, and neither let their guard down. They saw no sign of black SUVs that day. No suspicious watchers on the dirt road. By late evening, Henry dared to hope the danger might be dissipating. After a simple supper of cornbread and ham, they sat in the living room with the TV muted, just to see if any news might hint at the situation. Frank dozed off in the armchair, head lolling forward. Henry felt his own eyes grow heavy. A wave of exhaustion swept over him. Maybe, he thought, after all that's happened, we're finally in the clear. But that notion shattered around midnight. A sudden clatter rattled the cans outside, one of their tripwires. Frank snapped awake instantly, adrenaline flooding his system. Henry grabbed the old hunting rifle by the door. Heart pounding, they darted to the window, lights off. In the faint moonlight, Henry glimpsed shapes moving near the barn. Multiple figures, dark silhouettes, quickly spreading out. Frank's voice was tense. "They're back, and in numbers." Henry's gut churned. He counted at least 5 or 6, possibly more. They moved with coordinated purpose, a stark contrast to the single intrusion days before. Farther down the driveway, Henry glimpsed the reflective glint of multiple vehicle headlights. They'd come in force. He swallowed hard. "What do we do? They might be armed to the teeth." Frank motioned for him to crouch low. "We hold them off, show them we're not easy prey." His gaze flicked to Henry's rifle. "You ready for this?" Henry's hands trembled on the stock. He was no soldier, but he'd shoot if it meant defending his home. "I'll do what I have to," he managed. Together, they slipped out the side door, hugging the house's shadow. The intruders advanced methodically, scanning the yard with flashlights. Henry recognized the tall silhouette of the man who'd first confronted him. Rage flared at the memory. A deep voice carried across the yard. "Henry Cole, we know you helped that man escape. We have questions. Come out now, and we won't wreck the place." Frank exchanged a glance with Henry, shaking his head. They're bluffing. They'll wreck everything if they feel like it. Henry's chest burned with anxiety, but he found his voice. You don't belong here, he yelled, a slight quaver in his tone. I told you that man isn't here. The tall man's laughter sounded bitter. We know he's gone. But what did he tell you, Henry? If you're hiding information, we'll get it. A second voice snapped. Move in. Flashlights bobbed among the scattered structures. Henry took a shaking breath. Frank, use the lines, Frank said, voice hushed. We'll corral them. Don't let them gain the porch. Henry nodded, heart slamming. They'd set lines around the front yard, too, with cans and small noisemakers. He watched the lead intruder step forward, right into a taut strand. Metal clinked as a row of cans tumbled, creating a ruckus. The man cursed, shining a flashlight down. He spotted the tripwire too late, losing precious seconds. Frank seized the moment. He shouted from behind the tractor, Back off! This doesn't have to get bloody! He fired a warning shot into the dirt. The crack of gunfire ripped through the night. Sparks flew from a muzzle flash on the intruder's side. Bullets whizzed overhead, thudding into the barn's wooden siding. Henry instinctively ducked. His mind screamed with disbelief. This was his peaceful farm, now a war zone. Adrenaline surged. Henry aimed the rifle in the general direction of the muzzle flash. He squeezed the trigger, the recoil jarring his shoulder. He had no idea if he hit anything. He just wanted them to keep their distance. The intruders scattered, some diving behind the fence, others retreating behind vehicles for cover. Henry's breathing came in ragged gasps. Frank rolled to a new position, behind a stack of crates near the house. Another round of shots rang out, splintering wood. Henry flattened himself, praying none found their mark. It all happened in seconds, yet felt timeless. The tall man's voice boomed, Hold your fire, hold! The shooting paused. An eerie quiet settled in the darkness, the air heavy with gun smoke and tension. Henry's heart pounded so loudly he feared they'd hear it. He risked a glance around the tractor. Had they truly stopped? A moment later, the tall man called out, Henry, enough! Let's talk! His tone was tight with anger. Henry glanced at Frank, who gave a tiny shrug. He's stalling or planning something, Frank whispered. Don't trust it. Henry swallowed. You get out of here, he yelled back, and then we'll talk. Otherwise, I promise you'll find me more than ready to defend my home. Silence. Then the tall man said, We're not leaving without answers. What did he tell you about us? Who else have you contacted? Henry's nerves frayed. He scrambled for a reply. I contacted nobody. He told me nothing. You're wasting your time. Frank motioned for Henry to slide behind the crates. They might not believe you, he muttered. They think Jacob gave you intel. They could burn this place down looking for it. Henry's stomach lurched. The flashes of gunfire, the shouts, everything hammered home the reality that these men could indeed destroy his life. But fear gave way to a fierce resolve. He'd stand his ground. They'd have to tear him from it. A voice from the intruders hissed, Maybe we should just set the barn ablaze and flush him out. Bet he's hiding in there. Henry's breath caught. If they torched the barn, not only would he lose his livestock, but the flames could spread to the house. Frank tensed, face grim. The possibility of a raging fire filled Henry with horror. He clutched the rifle, knuckles white. Before another shot was fired, though, the faint wail of a siren drifted across the night air. Growing louder by the second, the intruders froze. Henry realized the neighbors or passers-by might have called the sheriff at the sound of gunshots. Relief battled fresh worry. Would the sheriff's arrival escalate the firefight? The tall man cursed audibly. We're pulling out, he barked. We'll handle this another time. Flashlights swung away, and Henry heard the rumble of engines starting. Vehicles peeled off in a rush, tires kicking gravel. Within moments the yard was still, save for the swirl of dust in headlights receding into the dark. Henry didn't dare move. He waited, heart hammering, until the siren drew closer. Through the gloom, a single patrol car turned onto the driveway. Henry and Frank exchanged shaken glances, stepping out of cover at last. Henry's hands still shook on the rifle. The sheriff's patrol car rolled to a stop, lights flashing red and blue across the bullet-pocked barn. Sheriff Dwight Rutherford climbed out, gun drawn but pointed low. "Henry Cole," he called, "what in blazes is going on?" He looked rattled. Henry stumbled forward, chest heaving. We got attacked," he managed, voice raw. "They left a minute ago." Rutherford scanned the scene, the scattered shells, the broken lines of cans. "Good Lord, you hurt?" He stepped closer, free hand grabbing his radio. "I need backup at Cole's place. Shots fired," he muttered into it, voice urgent. Frank stood behind Henry, posture tense. Henry's mouth was dry as he tried to answer. "We're okay. They wanted information about someone who passed through. They threatened to burn the barn." Rutherford's expression darkened. "All right, let's get your statement. Are you sure they're gone for now?" Henry nodded shakily. "I heard them drive off when they heard your siren." The sheriff looked around, eyes lingering on the bullet holes. "We'll do what we can to track them down, but you'd best prepare for more trouble. These folks don't back off easy." His gaze landed on Frank, eyebrows raised in question. Frank introduced himself, referencing a security background. The sheriff sighed. "Henry, I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I got a call about gunshots, but I was halfway across the county. If those men come back, call me again. Meantime, let's file a report. I'll get forensics out here in daylight." Henry could only nod, lungs still catching. The enormity of it all weighed on him. As Rutherford radioed in details, Henry caught Frank's eye. Both men understood. The danger was far from over. For the rest of that night, Henry hardly slept. The sheriff stayed for nearly 2 hours, taking statements and poking around with a flashlight to gather what evidence he could. Frank assisted by pointing out where the gunfire had come from, and Henry, still shaken, did his best to answer the sheriff's questions. At daybreak, a couple of deputies arrived to photograph the barn's bullet holes and the spent casings scattered on the hard-packed dirt. By then, Henry was running on nerves and coffee. He stood by the fence as the sun inched higher, listening to the camera clicks and the low murmur of official voices. Frank hovered nearby, scanning the horizon now and then as if expecting another wave of intruders. The sheriff's expression remained grim. He rubbed the back of his neck and conferred quietly with his deputies, then approached Henry and Frank, notebook in hand. "Whoever these folks are," Rutherford said, "they left hardly any trace besides bullet shells. No tire tracks other than your usual pattern on the driveway. My guess is they're well equipped and know how to avoid leaving evidence." He let out a weary sigh. "Henry, I can request extra patrols along the nearby roads for a while, but we're stretched thin as it is. I've got a half-dozen calls a day about petty theft and property disputes. Branlow County ain't used to paramilitary squads showing up at farmland." Henry nodded, a hollow feeling settling in his chest. "I understand, Sheriff. I appreciate anything you can do. I never imagined it'd come to this." Rutherford gave him a sympathetic look. "Me neither. But let's be clear. If they return, you call me, even if all you've got is a suspicion. Maybe we'll catch them in the act." He paused, lowering his voice. "And, Henry, are you sure you didn't pick up some trouble you shouldn't have? You said a fella passed through, but you're not telling me much." Henry exchanged a glance with Frank, who looked impassive. "I promise, Sheriff. I told you all I can," Henry said quietly. "That man was injured. I helped him. He left. I don't know anything about these people." Rutherford exhaled, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to push harder. "All right. We'll finalize the paperwork. In the meantime, don't do anything rash, and keep that rifle handy." By noon, the deputies had finished collecting evidence, and the patrol car rolled away. The yard, once bustling with talk and camera flashes, lay silent again. Bullet holes in the barn's wooden siding bore fresh testimony to the violence that had shattered Henry's peace. He and Frank stood in the dusty stillness, each man lost in thought. "You should get some rest," Frank said at last, eyeing Henry's pale face. "You've been running on fumes." Henry shook his head. "I've got chores, and I need to figure out how to fix those holes in the barn. If the goats get spooked by more gunshots, they might break loose." Frank frowned but didn't argue. He followed Henry inside the barn, helping him retrieve spare planks and nails. Together they patched the largest holes from the interior, each hammer stroke echoing in the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight. The activity gave Henry an odd sense of purpose. At least he could repair small things, even if the bigger problem loomed unresolved. They labored in near silence until Henry finally said, "Frank, you've done so much already. Might be time you get back to your own life. I can't expect you to babysit me forever." Frank paused, leaning against a post. "I can hold out a bit longer if you think they'll attack again soon. Don't forget I've dealt with worse than these punks. But if you really want me gone—" "It's not that," Henry replied quickly. "I'm grateful you stayed, but I can't keep dragging you into danger." Frank gave a half smile. "Henry, I figure we're both in the same boat now. They saw me here. They know I'm involved. If they want payback, they'll come after me too." He lifted a battered chunk of wood. "So might as well stand together." Henry managed a tight nod, a hint of relief in his eyes. They resumed hammering planks, finishing the makeshift repairs by early afternoon. Sweat dripped from their foreheads and their arms ached. The day's heat pressed down, making the barn's air heavy and stale. Eventually, Frank set his hammer aside. "Let's grab some water," he said, wiping his brow. "Then we can do a patrol around the property, see if we spot anything off." Inside the farmhouse, Henry poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher in his fridge. They drank in silence at the kitchen table, each man deep in thought. Henry couldn't shake the memory of muzzle flashes in the night. He wondered if the sheriff's presence would really deter anything or if it just prompted these attackers to plot a bigger assault. After a short break, they took the truck out, cruising slowly along the edges of Henry's fields. The cornstalks rose tall, rustling in a mid-afternoon breeze. Nothing seemed out of place, but Henry's nerves remained frayed. At the far corner, near a line of scraggly cedar trees, they found no footprints or sign of watchers. Returning to the yard, Henry's shoulders sagged with fatigue. As dusk approached, Frank cooked a simple dinner, canned vegetables and sausage, allowing Henry a rare chance to rest on the couch. Henry dozed off briefly, roused only when Frank gently tapped him to say supper was ready. They ate with subdued appetites, each lost in the swirl of possibilities. Outside, the sky shifted from orange to purple, the day receding into another uneasy night. "You think we should set up a watch schedule?" Frank asked as they cleared plates. "One of us sleeps, the other keeps guard." Henry rubbed tired eyes. "Might be wise. I'm not sure how many more nights of this I can take." Frank set a battered alarm clock on the table. "Let me take first watch. You get some sleep. I'll wake you around midnight." Henry wanted to protest, but felt too drained. He trudged to his bedroom, collapsing on the mattress. Sleep enveloped him in moments, though it was far from peaceful. He dreamed of shadowy figures creeping through fields, of gunshots echoing against barn walls. Finally, a soft knock on his door woke him. He fumbled for the lamp, blinking at Frank's silhouette. "Midnight," Frank said gently. "Your turn." Groggy, Henry dressed and stumbled into the living room. Frank looked exhausted, stifling a yawn. "No movement so far," he reported. "All quiet. If you see or hear anything suspicious, wake me." Henry nodded. Frank retreated to the guest bed, leaving Henry alone in the hush. He turned off the house lights, stepping onto the porch, the night sky spread wide, stars flickering above the silent farmland. Henry settled into the porch chair, rifle propped by his side, scanning the property's edge for movement. The barn loomed like a dark sentinel, bullet scars just visible in the faint glow. Time crawled. Each chirp of crickets sounded unnaturally loud. Henry's mind kept drifting. What if they never came back? He'd be forever on edge, expecting them at any moment. But if they did come back, how could he or Frank possibly fend off a larger force? Around 2 a.m, clouds veiled the stars, plunging the farm into deeper darkness. Henry's body ached with weariness, but he forced himself to stay alert. Another hour passed, the only activity the restless shuffle of goats in the pen. At last, Henry sensed dawn creeping closer, the blackness giving way to a hint of pale gray at the horizon. Relief fluttered in his chest. Maybe they'd made it through another night unscathed. He stood, yawning, stepping down into the yard to stretch. That was when a faint flash of light caught his peripheral vision. Frowning, he peered across the fields. A glimmer flickered again near the eastern fence line, too dim to be a flashlight, perhaps a reflection of metal. Henry's pulse quickened. "Frank," he hissed over his shoulder, but Frank was inside, presumably asleep. Henry cursed softly under his breath. He lifted the rifle, creeping toward the side of the house for a better angle. The darkness was profound, but he caught a fleeting silhouette. Someone crouched by the fence, maybe 2 people, though it was hard to tell. No vehicles were visible. Did they approach on foot? He considered shouting or firing a warning shot, but he didn't want to provoke them if they hadn't noticed him yet. Carefully, he retreated to the porch steps and rapped 3 times on the wall, a signal he'd arranged with Frank. Seconds later, Frank emerged from the door, blinking away sleep. Henry pointed toward the fence line. Frank nodded, face taut. Without a word, they circled around opposite sides of the house, trying to flank the intruders. Henry's heart thundered in his chest. The grass was damp with dew, muffling his footsteps. He reached the corner of a small tool shed, peering around it. Sure enough, 2 figures knelt near the fence, fiddling with something. It looked like a pair of small black devices. Henry's first horrified thought was that they might be planting explosives. He took a step forward, rifle raised. One of the men must have sensed movement because he froze, turning his head. In that split second, Henry glimpsed a narrow face and the gleam of an automatic pistol. Fear jolted through him. He forced himself to speak, voice trembling with anger he didn't entirely feel. "Stop right there." The men whirled. One sprang to his feet, leveling a gun at Henry, who ducked behind the shed's corner. A loud pop rang out. Henry's heart nearly leapt from his chest as a bullet smacked the shed's siding. Then Frank's shout sliced through the darkness. "Drop it!" Chaos erupted. The second intruder fired blindly in Frank's direction, muzzle flashing. Henry aimed around the shed corner, squeezed off a shot, and heard a startled cry. One man stumbled, but the other darted across the yard, diving low to avoid Frank's line of fire. Henry scrambled for cover again as more shots cracked the stillness. Adrenaline surged so powerfully, he almost forgot to breathe. In the frantic seconds that followed, Henry saw one shape vanish into the night, fleeing north. The other man lay on the ground, clutching a leg. Frank hurried over, gun still trained on the intruder, who hissed curses through clenched teeth. Henry, rifle trembling in his grip, approached cautiously. "Stay down!" Frank barked at the wounded man. He kicked away the pistol that lay nearby. Henry's stomach churned at the sight of blood staining the grass. This was not the life he'd ever imagined, forced to exchange gunfire in his own yard. Frank glanced at Henry. "You okay?" Henry's breath came in ragged gulps. I think so." He knelt, picking up a small black device the man had dropped. It resembled a thick metal cylinder with wires on one end. "Frank," Henry whispered, voice hoarse. "Is this—" Frank's eyes narrowed. "Could be a tracking device or a sabotage charge." He turned to the intruder, pressing his boot near the man's shoulder. You want to explain what you're doing on this property at 2 in the morning, planting gadgets on a farmer's fence. The man snarled, face contorted with pain. Go to hell. Henry's mind reeled. They'd come not in a brazen convoy, but on foot, stealthy, intending to plant something. Possibly to track Henry's movements, or to rig the fence line with explosives or cameras. He gritted his teeth in anger and fear. We should call the sheriff again, he said, though the memory of bullet holes and unhelpful leads made him doubt how much it would help. Frank agreed. Tie this one up first, he said, pulling a coil of thin rope from his belt. We can't let him slip away before the authorities arrive. Henry stooped to help, though his hands trembled uncontrollably. The intruder spat blood, still refusing to speak. At one point, Henry caught a glimpse of a patch on the man's vest, a stylized emblem he didn't recognize, maybe the logo of a private security firm. If they had patches, that might be a lead for the sheriff. Within minutes, Frank had the intruder's hands bound. The man groaned at the tightness, but Frank's expression remained stony. Henry sprinted back to the house, heart hammering, to call Rutherford. He managed a breathless explanation of the attempted planting of devices and the gunfire exchanged. Rutherford promised to hurry over. When Henry returned outside, he saw the wounded intruder pinned against the fence post, Frank's boot near his chest. A smaller black object lay a few feet away, another cylinder. The second intruder had definitely escaped with unknown gear. The night air felt thick with tension and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Sheriff's on his way, Henry said softly, keeping the rifle cradled across his arm. Frank nodded, never taking his eyes off the captive. If we can figure out who he's working for, maybe that helps. But from what I've seen, these guys are tight-lipped. They might fear their bosses more than they fear the law. Henry's gaze flicked over the yard. This can't go on, he said, voice breaking. They'll keep coming until... I don't even know until what. Frank's eyes softened. We'll handle it. One step at a time. Now that we've got a live one, maybe the sheriff can dig something up. Hang in there, Henry. The sirens arrived faster this time, perhaps because Rutherford had left additional units patrolling nearby after the last shootout. 2 deputies stepped out, weapons raised, but they lowered them upon seeing Frank and Henry in control of the situation. Rutherford appeared, a mixture of frustration and relief on his face. Another shootout, he muttered. And you've got a suspect. All right, let's see what we have. He motioned to the deputies, who relieved Frank of the intruder, cuffing him more securely. The man glared at them in furious silence. Rutherford squatted by the black devices, examining them with a flashlight. Well, this looks mighty suspicious. Mind telling me what you were planning on private property? He asked the prisoner. Silence. The man turned his head away, refusing to speak. Rutherford scowled, then waved his hand at a deputy. Load him up. We'll see if a night in the county lockup loosens that tongue. One deputy seized the contraband items with gloved hands, bagging them as evidence. Henry and Frank gave the sheriff a halting account of what happened. Rutherford listened, brow furrowing. This is the second time in a week. Now they're sneaking in on foot. I'll do what I can, but I'll be honest. It feels like I'm chasing shadows here. Henry sighed. I know, but maybe that device can be traced, or maybe this one will talk eventually. Rutherford didn't look optimistic. We'll try. You two better be ready for more of this. Whatever they're after, they're not done. Staring at the battered fence and the smear of blood on the grass, Henry felt both horror and fury. He couldn't keep living this way, under siege by unknown aggressors. But no solution presented itself except to stand firm and hope the law prevailed. Shifting his gaze to Frank, Henry thought, at least I'm not alone. Dawn was just streaking the sky by the time the deputies finished taking statements and drove off with their captive. Henry and Frank stood side by side in the yard, listening to the last echoes of sirens fade. Another night gone. Another brush with violence survived. Yet the question hung in the tense hush of the early morning. How many more such nights could they endure? And what would it ultimately cost Henry to protect a man who was already gone, but whose secrets still cast a long and dangerous shadow over this quiet farm? Morning spread its first rays over Henry's farm, catching on the broken fence, where bloodstains still glistened wet. Frank stood beside Henry, both men silent in the wake of the sheriff's departure. They had handed over the injured intruder, the incriminating gadgets, and their statements. Yet despite that small victory, a heavy unease weighed on them. It felt like standing in the eye of a storm that could break loose again at any moment. Neither had slept more than a handful of hours in days, but the rush of adrenaline kept them upright. Finally, Henry motioned toward the house, voice hoarse. "Let's get inside, clean up, and figure out what comes next." They trudged in, setting their weapons aside. Henry washed his hands at the kitchen sink, scrubbing away traces of grime and anxiety. He glanced around at his humble surroundings, crooked cabinets, a chipped countertop, the battered stove. This place, always his sanctuary, now felt threatened at every corner. Outside, the goats bleated, and the old rooster crowed. Life on the farm went on, ignorant of the sudden menace coiled at its boundary. Frank slid into a chair, wincing as he rotated his shoulder. "Took a bit of recoil from those shots," he muttered. "I'll be fine, just sore." He shot Henry a tight smile. "You okay?" Henry nodded, though his hands shook faintly when he reached for the coffee pot. "I will be," he said. "Been too long since I faced anything like this. Honestly, I never have faced anything like this. I keep thinking maybe I'm asleep, dreaming." "Unfortunately, it's real," Frank replied. He folded his arms on the table. "We got lucky again. They retreated when we fought back, and the sheriff arrived quickly. But luck runs out." Henry eased into the opposite chair, sipping black coffee that tasted bitter on his parched tongue. He had no appetite for breakfast, only an uneasy swirl in his stomach. "They keep coming at us different ways. First, a big show of force in SUVs, then stealth teams planting devices. It's like they're testing our responses." Frank nodded. "They might have a bigger plan. They've got resources, that's clear. They're not amateurs. If we keep embarrassing them, handing over one of their men to the sheriff, they might escalate to a point of no return." Henry closed his eyes, trying not to envision bullets tearing his farmhouse to splinters. "This is my land," he whispered. "I can't just flee like Jacob did." Frank drummed his fingers on the table. "Let me talk to some contacts. There might be a way to get you secure, or maybe we find out who these people really are. Shine a bigger light on them. If they're criminals, we bring federal eyes to this." He frowned. "The local sheriff is out of his depth. No disrespect to Rutherford. He can't fight an army." Henry sighed. "I'm worried that if we call in more outside help, it might paint an even bigger target. But I guess these men have already painted it for us, haven't they?" "Indeed," Frank said. "We'll see what the sheriff learns from that captive. Might be he cracks under questioning." They both knew it was a long shot. Men like that were trained not to talk, or they feared their superiors more than anything else. Still, it was a glimmer of hope that the law might glean a clue about who was orchestrating the attacks. They spent the next few hours in a subdued routine. Henry feeding animals, Frank double-checking the perimeter lines, each man casting wary glances at the roads. Only a single truck passed by. Old Win Fletcher's again, rattling along. He didn't stop, though he slowed, perhaps thinking better of disturbing Henry after all that commotion. By midday, Frank decided to make some calls. He stepped onto the porch with a burner phone, purchased in town for privacy, and dialed a few numbers. Henry lingered in the living room, occasionally hearing Frank's low, terse voice. It reminded Henry of how little he knew about Frank's post-army life, the contacts he'd cultivated, the experiences that hardened him. Yet Henry felt grateful for the presence of someone who understood strategies and security better than he ever could. When Frank finished and came back inside, he seemed pensive. One of my acquaintances says there's talk of a private security group, Hush Hush, rumored to operate around these parts for wealthy interests. Could be corporate, could be political. The guess is they do dirty work under the table. Threats, recoveries, intimidation. That fits, Henry said grimly, recalling the men's professional tactics and hush-hush approach. So they're hired muscle, basically. Frank nodded. Yes, but well-trained muscle, not just random thugs. And if their bosses are big enough... He left the implication hanging. The possibility that local authorities wouldn't stand a chance against their influence. Henry set his jaw. We need more than the local sheriff, then. Agreed. Frank paused. We might consider contacting state or federal agencies. But that's your call. Once we do that, things escalate. If these men have high-level connections, we could be stirring a hornet's nest. On the other hand, doing nothing leaves you at their mercy. Henry stared out the window at the dusty yard. He thought of the bullet holes, the night assaults, the fear that might never end if he didn't push back. Slowly, he said, I don't see another way. We've got to do something. I can't keep living like this day after day. Frank gave a firm nod. Then let's talk to the sheriff. We'll ask him to put us in touch with the state police or someone at the next level. Provide them with the evidence so far. Shell casings, the captured device from last night. If we can show there's an organized group targeting your farm, maybe they'll send real backup. The plan made sense, though Henry felt a pang of doubt. If these men had influence, would state or federal assistance truly help? Still, it was a step beyond simply waiting to be attacked again. They left the farm mid-afternoon, driving Henry's old pickup to the sheriff's station in town. The roads were quiet. Each time they passed a dark-colored vehicle, Henry found himself tensing, but none were the sleek black SUVs. At the station, Rutherford met them with an anxious expression. Henry, Frank, he greeted, ushering them into his small office. The space was cramped. A desk stacked with files, a couple of battered chairs, a photo of Rutherford's wife and kids on a shelf. The sheriff gestured for them to sit. We've done a preliminary interview with that prisoner from last night, but so far he's stonewalling, refuses to identify his employer or his own name. Frank asked, What about the devices? Rutherford pulled a folder from the desk. Tech folks from the state lab took a look. They're trackers with embedded cameras, like a covert surveillance or perimeter alarm system. If they'd planted them, they could monitor movement or gather data remotely. That alone is suspicious as hell. But no direct leads on who manufactured them. Could be purchased illegally. Henry rubbed his forehead, frustration boiling. Sheriff, we can't keep fending off this group. They've got more resources than you or me. We need bigger help. Rutherford sighed. I know. I've been on the phone with the state police. They're sending an investigator tomorrow. Possibly more, if he deems it serious enough. He paused, then leaned forward, voice low. But let's be straight. These guys might have friends in high places. I've seen that before. I'll do everything in my power, but I can't promise miracles. Frank nodded. At least it's a step. If the state police come, they'll see the bullet holes, the seized devices, the prisoner. That's evidence. Maybe they can trace the chain of command. Henry recalled Jacob's talk of powerful people wanting him silenced. He felt a flicker of guilt at not revealing the full truth to Rutherford. Then again, the fewer people who knew, the safer it might be for Jacob. Henry just hoped that the partial story he'd shared would suffice to bring enough help. Rutherford tapped his pen against the desk. Let's plan on you two staying on high alert. Keep watch tonight, same as before. If anything happens, call me immediately. We'll coordinate with the state officer who's arriving in the morning. Understood, said Henry, weariness tugging at him. "We appreciate it." They left the station, stepping into the bright sunlight of midsummer. Frank placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "Let's get back and rest up. Tonight could be another test." Henry eyed the row of parked police cars. "Part of me hopes they come again," he muttered bitterly. "So maybe we can catch more of them. But mostly I just want them gone forever." The ride home was uneventful, though Henry couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror. His farm seemed deceptively tranquil when they pulled in, just the dusty drive, the quiet barn, goats in the pen, and the cicadas humming. But the memory of gunshots echoed in his mind, and each shadow felt ominous. They grabbed a quick supper, sandwiches Henry threw together from leftover ham, and then prepared once more for a long night. This time they set up a stronger perimeter near the fence where the devices were planted. Frank rigged a fishing line connected to small bells at the fence posts, an upgrade to the earlier noisemakers. Henry helped test the tension, each tinny chime sounding uncomfortably like an alarm about to go off. As darkness settled, they took positions. Frank posted near the barn with a vantage on the fence lines, Henry on the porch as a second set of eyes. A faint moon hung overhead, and the hush of farmland night enveloped them. An hour, then 2 hours, drifted by. Henry forced himself to stay vigilant despite his fatigue. He thought about the state investigator coming the next day. Maybe that would tip the balance, force these men into retreat, or risk bigger legal repercussions. After midnight, Frank quietly circled back to the porch for a quick conference. "All clear so far," he said under his breath. "You see anything?" Henry shook his head, stifling a yawn. "Just the occasional stray cat, or maybe a raccoon rustling in the corn." Frank's lips curved into a slight grin. Might be the first truly quiet night in days. He paused, scanning the yard. "I'll do another pass around the barn." Before he could move, headlights flared in the distance. Only a brief flash, like someone turning onto the dirt road from the main highway. Henry tensed, stepping to the porch rail. The lights vanished, perhaps dipped behind a small rise in the land. Then they reappeared, closer this time. Henry and Frank exchanged glances. "Could be a lost motorist," Henry whispered, but his heart hammered. At nearly 1 a.m, with all that had happened, he doubted it was innocent. Frank signaled for Henry to douse the porch light. They retreated into the shadow by the door. The distant vehicle's engine rumbled, faint but growing. Soon, a single set of headlights swam into focus. It pulled near the gate by Henry's drive, halting there. The engine idled. Henry's hands clenched around the rifle. "Not good," he breathed. Frank narrowed his eyes. "They're deciding whether to come in." Seconds stretched. Then, in a jolt of motion, the vehicle whipped onto Henry's drive. An older pickup, not a sleek SUV. The truck advanced slowly. Henry's heart lurched. Had the men switched vehicles to throw him off? As it neared, Henry flicked on a flashlight, directing the beam toward the windshield. He stood on the porch, rifle at the ready. Frank edged behind him, gun in hand. The driver braked with a screech, headlights illuminating a swirl of dust. Henry's finger tightened on the trigger. A window slid down, revealing an anxious face he recognized. Winston Fletcher. Henry's heart pounded at the sudden shift from potential threat to neighbor. He and Frank lowered their weapons, stepping forward. "Win?" Henry said, voice tense. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Win's eyes darted around. "Sorry, Henry, didn't mean to spook you. But I got wind from a friend in town that more suspicious folks might be headed this way. Thought I'd come warn you." Frank exhaled slowly, stashing his pistol. "You nearly got shot." Win swallowed. "I know. I flashed my headlights, but I guess you were expecting trouble." He gestured frantically. "Look, I heard the scuttlebutt that some black SUVs were seen near the county line. People say they could be on the move tonight." Henry's stomach clenched. "I appreciate it, Win, but you're putting yourself at risk coming here alone." Win shrugged, though his pallor betrayed nervousness. "I had to do something. You're my neighbor, Henry. This entire county's talking about how you've been targeted." He looked around at the dark farmyard. "I came to offer help. I got my shotgun, a handful of friends who can come if you want." Henry exchanged a glance with Frank, who nodded thoughtfully. "An extra set of eyes might help keep them from trying a sneak attack," Frank admitted. "But we can't guarantee your safety, Winston." Wynne firmed his jaw. "I'm not a soldier or anything, but I'll stand by you. These creeps don't get to terrorize our county." Henry felt a mix of gratitude and worry. The last thing he wanted was for neighbors to be harmed. But maybe, if more folks banded together, the intruders would think twice. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you. We'll see if your friends can come by tomorrow, maybe. For now, keep your wits about you." Wynne nodded, reversing the truck to park near the barn. He climbed out, shotgun in hand. Henry still heard the rapid thud of his own pulse as he tried to calm down from that scare. Together, the three men scanned the farmland under the moonlight, waiting for a sign of SUVs or any lurking shapes at the fence line. The hours inched along, but no further vehicles appeared. Around 4 a.m, they allowed themselves to relax fractionally. Wynne perched by the barn door, shotgun across his lap, while Frank and Henry took turns patrolling. When dawn finally glowed on the horizon, none of them had glimpsed so much as a flicker of headlights. Henry guessed the rumored movement near the county line might have been a false alarm, or the watchers had decided not to strike. Either way, that morning found him, Frank, and Wynne exhausted, but relieved. They trudged inside for coffee, the house crowded with 3 men, a rifle, a pistol, and a shotgun propped by the door. It felt surreal. Wynne rubbed bleary eyes. "I'll head home soon, try to get some sleep. Let me know if you want me to round up more neighbors." Frank shook his hand. "Thanks for stepping up. Hopefully we won't need a militia, but we might not be able to do this alone." Wynne nodded, tipping an imaginary hat to Henry. "I'm on your side, neighbor. Hang in there." Then he left, pulling away in his old pickup. Henry turned to Frank, who was refilling mugs. "We made it through another night," he murmured. "But this can't go on forever." Frank sipped his coffee, expression grave. "Let's see what the state investigator says. Maybe that changes the game." Henry nodded. As the sunlight chased the last shadows from the farmyard, he felt as though he stood on the edge of a precipice. Another day dawned, another fragile reprieve. Yet the storm clouds still gathered, and Henry braced for the next gust of violence that threatened to sweep away everything he'd built. A profound weariness weighed on Henry Cole that morning as he paced the front yard, waiting for the state investigator to arrive. He glanced anxiously at the bullet-scarred barn, the patched fence, and the weary goats milling in their pen. His farm was still functioning, but the sense of peace he once cherished felt distant as a memory. Beside him, Frank checked his watch, face impassive. "She should be here soon," Frank said. Rutherford mentioned she was driving down from the state capitol. Henry nodded, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. Though the morning air was mild, his anxiety made him feel overheated. He recalled how just a week ago, his biggest concern had been ensuring the irrigation pump wouldn't fail. Now he couldn't even walk his property without scanning for intruders. A distant plume of dust on the road caught Henry's attention. Moments later, a dark sedan emerged, rolling toward the house at a measured pace. Henry swallowed, hopeful that this was the investigator the sheriff had promised. The car parked, and a woman stepped out, dressed in a crisp blazer and slacks. She was tall, with short dark hair pulled back, and she moved with an air of composed purpose. "Mr. Cole?" she called, lifting a small ID wallet. "I'm Agent Marcia Lawson, State Bureau of Investigation." Her voice was level, a professional edge in her tone. Henry managed a shaky smile. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming." He motioned to Frank. "This is my friend Frank Adams, who's been helping me." Agent Lawson offered Frank a brisk handshake. She scanned the property with narrowed eyes, taking in the bullet holes and the general disarray. "Sheriff Rutherford briefed me, but I'd like to hear the details from you." She followed Henry and Frank inside, and they settled around the kitchen table. Henry poured coffee he wasn't sure anyone would drink. Agent Lawson set down a slim laptop and clicked on a small recorder. "All right," she said. "From the top, please." Over the next half hour, Henry and Frank recounted the string of events: finding Jacob injured, the first search by the black-suited men, the nighttime assaults, the attempts to plant surveillance devices. Henry tried not to flinch when recalling gunfire in his barnyard. Frank offered a concise account of how they fought back, capturing one intruder who was now in local custody. Agent Lawson typed rapidly, her eyes flicking between Henry and Frank. Occasionally, she asked clarifying questions. How many vehicles, what logos or marks they'd seen, the approximate timing of each attack. She even inquired whether Henry had any reason to suspect a personal vendetta unrelated to Jacob. "No, ma'am," Henry insisted. "I've never had enemies. I'm just a farmer. Jacob was the one they wanted, but they seem to think I have secrets he shared." When they finished, Lawson tapped her pen on the table. "All right," she said quietly. "I've reviewed the devices the sheriff's office seized. They're high-end trackers and micro cameras. Not common in run-of-the-mill crimes around here. That points to well-funded operators." Frank leaned forward. "We suspect a private security outfit, possibly linked to powerful corporate interests. The men we've seen are disciplined, well-coordinated." Lawson nodded. "I'm inclined to agree. This surpasses small-time criminals. The question is, how high does it go? And how do we make them back off?" She rubbed her brow. "Sheriff Rutherford says you're hoping for more manpower. Unfortunately, mobilizing a full state task force requires a more concrete link to a recognized crime syndicate or direct threats to local officials." Henry grimaced. "So you can't just place protection here?" She offered a sympathetic look. "We could arrange periodic patrols, but we don't have the resources to station men here around the clock. However, I am authorized to investigate deeper. I can lean on the prisoner in custody, see if I can break him, or identify his employer." Frank's jaw tightened. "I've seen men like that. They don't talk easily." Lawson shrugged. "Sometimes they do if they sense the ship is sinking. I'll try. But you should still prepare for more aggression." She turned to Henry. "Have you heard from this Jacob since he left? Do you know where he is?" Henry shook his head. "No idea," he lied, hoping she wouldn't press. He honestly didn't know Jacob's exact location, and he suspected it was safer that way. "He just vanished. I doubt he'll contact me." Lawson studied him intently. "If he does, please let me know. His testimony could be crucial in exposing whoever's behind these attacks. Without a direct line to their wrongdoing, it's hard for me to escalate this further up the chain." Henry nodded, understanding the limitations of her role, but still feeling a rising desperation. "What am I supposed to do in the meantime? Wait for another ambush in the dead of night?" Lawson's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. We'll do what we can. I'll push for immediate follow-up on this incident and see if we can hold the suspect longer to glean intel. If these men attempt another assault, we'll respond. But keep in mind, they operate outside the law. They may not be deterred by arrests unless they fear a bigger entity, federal involvement, or major public exposure." She paused, then handed him a card. "Call me directly if they show up again. I'll come as fast as I can." They walked her around the farm, showing the damage. She noted bullet holes, took photographs, and asked further questions about vantage points. Then, just as carefully as she arrived, she climbed back into her state-issued sedan. Standing in the driveway, Henry felt both gratitude and frustration. Agent Lawson wanted to help, but she admitted that real muscle from the state wouldn't materialize without solid proof linking these armed men to a broader network. That meant Henry remained painfully vulnerable. Frank seemed to read Henry's thoughts. "She's trying, Henry, but the bureaucracy moves slowly." Henry exhaled, stepping onto the porch. "I can't help feeling we're on our own. You, me, and a few neighbors who can't stop a serious assault." Frank didn't contradict him. He looked out over the property, scanning the quiet afternoon. "Maybe it's time to think about leaving for a while, until this blows over or until the feds can intervene." Henry stiffened. "I told you this is my land. I can't just abandon it. The crops, the animals, my whole life is here." Frank sighed. "I get it. But your life matters more than the land. And if they come in force—" Henry's tone hardened. "No. I don't plan to die, but I'm not giving up my home. If that's foolish, so be it." They dropped the subject, tension lingering in the hush. Henry's mind churned. Could he remain steadfast without drawing a final cataclysmic attack? Perhaps if the state investigator managed to spook them, or if the captive intruder coughed up names, the group would back off. Until then, he had to keep defending his corner of the world. They passed another quiet day with Henry tending chores and Frank keeping watch. The goats needed hay, the fence needed minor repairs, and Henry insisted on normal tasks as a form of stubborn pride. He paused only when neighbors stopped by. Miss Templeton from down the road brought a casserole, hearing rumors Henry was under siege. Her eyes brimmed with concern. Henry thanked her, feeling awkward about the pity in her expression. That evening, Winston Fletcher returned with 2 men in a battered SUV. They offered to help stand guard. Henry appreciated the gesture but didn't want a crowd turning his property into a paramilitary camp. He politely said he'd call if he needed more eyes. The men left, though not without lingering glances at Frank, perhaps curious about the stoic former soldier. Night fell once more, a haze of orange at the horizon giving way to deep indigo skies. Henry thought of Jacob and wondered if he was safe. If Jacob truly had enough evidence to bring these attackers down, maybe he was meeting with contacts, building a case. Or perhaps he'd gone to ground, too scared to act. The not knowing weighed on Henry. He and Frank again split the nighttime watch. They sat on the porch, rifles within reach, scanning for headlights that never appeared. Midnight slipped by with no alarms triggered. Exhaustion tugged at Henry's eyelids, and he finally let Frank take over around 2 a.m. He drifted to bed and slept fitfully, dreaming of armed men tearing through his fields. Morning sunrise found him still shaken by those dreams, but relieved he'd survived yet another night without incident. He joined Frank at the breakfast table, half expecting the phone to ring with some dire update from Agent Lawson. But the day stretched on in relative calm. Local news carried no mention of paramilitary squads or corporate conspiracies, just the usual stories about county fairs and road repairs. Later that afternoon, the sheriff called. Henry braced for more bad news, but Rutherford's voice sounded cautiously optimistic. "The suspect lawyered up but isn't out on bail yet," he said. "We found a partial lead on the devices, maybe purchased through a shell company. Agent Lawson is following it." Henry exhaled, letting a sliver of hope take root. "That's something. So do you think they'll stay away for now?" Rutherford's tone was guarded. "Hard to say. Don't drop your defenses, but it seems they're regrouping at least. No sightings of black SUVs on the highways for the past 24 hours. After hanging up, Henry told Frank the news. Frank grunted, crossing his arms. "They're pausing. Could be good, or it could mean they're planning a bigger move, but let's be thankful for any lull." 3 days passed in this uneasy stalemate. Henry and Frank took turns watching at night, but no suspicious vehicles appeared. By the 3rd day, Henry began to tentatively believe they might have forced the attackers into retreat. He felt half ashamed of the relief coursing through him. He thought, if we made it this far, maybe the storm's passed. On the fourth day, Frank mentioned that he might return home soon. "I can't stay here indefinitely, Henry," he said gently. "I've got business to attend to, but if you need me, I'll come back." Henry's gut twisted with both gratitude and worry. "I understand," he said. "You've done more than enough. Maybe it's safe now." "Let's hope so." Frank gave him a weary smile. "Keep your phone on you, and please, if anything happens, call me. I can be here in a couple hours. Also, keep in touch with Agent Lawson." They spent one last evening reinforcing the barn's doors and double-checking the lines. Then, the next morning, Frank packed his sedan. Winston Fletcher, hearing that Frank was leaving, offered to stop by Henry's place more often. That gave Henry an ounce of comfort. He clapped Frank on the shoulder. "Can't thank you enough, friend," Henry said. "You stood by me through the worst of it." Frank nodded. "Take care, Henry. I'll be back if need be." With that, he drove off, dust trailing behind. Henry stood by the porch, watching the car vanish. For the first time since the ordeal began, he was truly alone again. That day and the next passed without incident. Henry continued his chores, repaired some irrigation lines, and even drove into town for supplies. People asked him how he was holding up. He gave polite reassurances, though his eyes often darted toward the window. Each evening, he locked up the house, triple-checked the yard, and tried to sleep. The nights were eerily quiet. Then, on the 7th day since the last attack, as Henry was out in the field at twilight examining his corn, he noticed a figure in the distance. They stood by the far fence line, motionless. Henry froze, heart pounding. He glanced around for anything threatening, no black SUVs, no sign of multiple men. Just one lone silhouette. Cautiously, Henry approached. As he drew nearer, he recognized the battered denim jacket and the lean posture. It was Jacob. He stood leaning on the fence, face drawn, eyes anxious. Henry stared in disbelief. "What? How?" Jacob managed a weak half-smile. "Henry, sorry for showing up unannounced." His voice sounded strained. "But I had nowhere else to go." A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Henry. Relief that Jacob was alive, anger that he might have led those attackers back, guilt that Jacob felt forced to return. He glanced at the fields, scanning for watchers. "We can't talk here," he said, voice tense. "Follow me." They trudged across the property in silence, shadows growing long. Henry took Jacob into the barn, out of view from any roads. He flicked on a lantern, revealing Jacob's pallid complexion, the bruises under his eyes. "What happened?" Henry demanded. "You were supposed to be safe. I thought you had people to help you." Jacob lowered himself onto a bale of straw, wincing. "I did meet them. We tried to gather more evidence, get it into the right hands, but somebody got spooked. There were leaks. Suddenly, these men were hunting me again. They came too close twice. So I ran. I figured your farm might be the last place they'd expect me to return." Henry's heart sank. They might not expect it, but if they sniff out your trail... He couldn't finish, the dread knotting his stomach. "Jacob, this is dangerous." "I know," Jacob said, voice trembling. "But I'm desperate. I wouldn't have come otherwise. I just need a place to lie low for a couple of days, then I can slip out again. I can't keep running without rest." Henry pressed a hand to his forehead, torn between compassion and self-preservation. "They nearly killed me. They nearly burned my barn down. If they find you here again..." Jacob's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry, Henry. Really. I'll leave if you want, but I couldn't think of anywhere else to go." A silent beat passed. Then Henry sighed heavily. "No, you're here now. I won't turn you away, but we have to be smart. I'll call Agent Lawson right away and see if she can protect you. Maybe this time we bring federal light to everything you know." Jacob looked up, eyes flickering with exhausted relief. "You think she can keep me safe?" Henry's mind whirled. He recalled her words. If Jacob came forward, they might escalate the matter. But also, A real investigation might blow the attacker's cover. At this point, it felt like the only viable path. "I hope so," he murmured, "because I can't keep fending off these men on my own." Jacob nodded, then slumped over, clearly spent. Henry fetched a spare blanket, draping it over the man's trembling frame. He wondered if he should phone Frank too, but first he needed to contact Lawson. If this truly was the break they needed, Jacob, ready to share details, it might force those hidden powers out of the shadows. Henry stepped outside, the lantern light fading behind him. The sky was a deep navy, stars blinking awake. Anxiety coiled tight in his chest. He knew that sheltering Jacob again would invite more violence if they weren't quick. But the man was desperate, and Henry's conscience wouldn't allow him to turn him away. Pulling out his cell phone, Henry dialed Agent Lawson. Time to end this, he thought, or at least bring it to a decisive confrontation. And if it cost him his farm, then so be it. He'd already paid too high a price. The phone rang 4 times before Agent Lawson answered. Henry stood just outside the barn, pressing the device to his ear with one hand while keeping a nervous eye on the darkened yard. Twilight had deepened into a star-dotted night, and the farm's familiar shapes seemed steeped in foreboding. He felt the cool evening air on his cheeks as he forced steady breaths, willing himself to remain calm. "Lawson," came the clipped voice on the other end. "Agent, it's Henry Cole," he said, his tone hushed to avoid carrying sound into the barn. "Jacob's back, the man they were after. He showed up just now." A short pause crackled over the line. "He came back to you? Is he in danger at this moment?" "He's exhausted, bruised. Says their network is after him again. We need help. Fast. He's ready to share everything he knows, if it'll get him protection." Lawson's voice hardened with resolve. "That's significant, Mr. Cole. Where is he now?" "In my barn." Henry felt a prickle of guilt at speaking so openly. Still, if he wanted help, honesty was needed. "He can't keep running. Will you come tonight?" "I'm 2 hours away," Lawson replied. "I'll alert Sheriff Rutherford. We'll coordinate a safe extraction for him. The best move might be to transport him to a secure location or put him in protective custody if he'll testify." Henry drew in a shaky breath. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just don't want those men to strike again while he's here." "I understand. Try to keep him hidden and keep your phone on. We'll come prepared in unmarked vehicles to avoid tipping off watchers. Whatever you do, don't let him out of your sight. If they discover he returned, they'll likely come in force." Henry thanked her and ended the call. The gravity of what he'd set in motion pressed on his chest. Setting the phone in his pocket, he drew a long breath and walked back inside the barn. Jacob, hunched over on the straw bale, lifted weary eyes. "Was that the investigator?" he asked, voice raspy. Henry nodded, kneeling beside him. "She's on her way. Couple hours, maybe less. They'll take you somewhere safer. You can finally tell them everything." Jacob's jaw clenched, fear and relief warring on his face. "I'm done hiding," he said softly. "I'll give them every file name, every source, anything that helps bring these people down." Henry put a hand on Jacob's shoulder, feeling how the man trembled under his grip. "I'll get you some water, maybe some bread. You just hang on." Over the next hour, Henry sat with Jacob, occasionally stepping outside the barn to peer across the moonlit fields. The minutes seemed to crawl. Henry kept replaying the phone call. Lawson would coordinate with Rutherford, come quietly, gather Jacob. Then, presumably, they would rush him to a safe location. If that happened without interference, it might break the siege that had consumed Henry's life. But as the clock ticked, Henry's nerves remained on edge. He thought he heard faint rustling among the cornstalks, or the low rumble of an engine far off. Each time his heart lurched, expecting a wave of black-clad men to surge from the dark. Yet the field stayed still, the gravel drive empty. Jacob managed a few sips of water, though he was too keyed up to eat. "I never meant for you to be a target," he whispered at one point. eyes distant. I thought I'd stay away long enough that they'd forget you. Henry exhaled slowly. They haven't come in days. Maybe we've got a slim chance to get you out without them noticing, but we can't assume. Jacob grimaced, fingers twisting in the edges of the blanket Henry had given him. I owe you more than I can ever repay. I'm not looking for repayment, Jacob, Henry murmured. I just want my farm, and you to be safe from all this. They lapsed into silence again. Another hour slipped by. At last, Henry's phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He answered in a rush. It's Lawson, came the crisp voice. We're on the approach. Rutherford and I have 2 vehicles. We'll kill our headlights a mile out and come quietly. You see anything suspicious? Henry scanned the driveway. No, it's dark and empty. Good. Expect us in 10 minutes, she said. Then the line went dead. Henry pocketed the phone, a ripple of tension and hope washing through him. They'll be here soon, he told Jacob. Let's get you ready to move. We'll slip you into their car and you'll be gone before anyone can react. Jacob braced against the straw bale, pain etched on his face as he tried to stand. He clutched his side, evidence of lingering injuries. Henry helped support him, guiding him toward the barn's sliding door. They paused in the gloom, waiting. Outside, starlight bathed the gravel drive in silvery hues. A few minutes later, Henry heard the quiet crunch of tires. True to Lawson's word, no headlights pierced the darkness, just the subtle glow of the moon reflecting off 2 vehicles rolling to a stop. Henry stepped forward cautiously, still holding Jacob upright, and recognized Agent Lawson stepping out of the driver's seat of the first car. Sheriff Rutherford climbed from the passenger side, a hand on his holstered sidearm. Mr. Cole, Lawson whispered, scanning the yard. We'll do this fast. Where's Jacob? Jacob mustered what little strength he had, letting the 2 officials see him. I'm here, he said softly, ready to leave. Lawson nodded, relief clear on her face. Come on, both of you, let's get inside these vehicles. We've got a bigger support team waiting on the main highway in case we're followed. Henry swallowed thickly. I'll help you load him in, but I'm staying here. This is my home. Rutherford frowned. Henry, you sure? These folks might retaliate once they find out he's cooperating. Henry forced a tight smile. I won't run away. But I do appreciate you checking in on me. Maybe if they do come, they'll find an empty barn. He turned to Jacob, voice unsteady. This is for the best. You hand over everything you've got, so they can put those men away. Jacob's eyes brimmed with gratitude. Thank you, Henry. I'll never forget what you did. Together, they guided Jacob into the back seat of Lawson's sedan. He winced, shifting to find a comfortable position. Rutherford hovered, scanning the darkness. We should leave now before anyone notices, he muttered. Henry stepped back, the night air cold on his skin. Watching Jacob settle into the vehicle triggered a sense of finality. Maybe, he thought, this is the moment everything changes, that the threat breaks apart. He forced a nod of farewell. Be safe. Lawson gave him a firm look. I'll do my best to keep him alive. If these attackers come for you, call me. I'll stay in contact. In near silence, they pulled away, engines low, headlights still off. Henry stood in the yard, heart pounding as the vehicles vanished down the dirt lane. Once the dust settled, the night was quiet again. A wave of relief mingled with lingering dread. If the attackers realized Jacob had shown up again and was now gone, they might descend in fury. Yet if Jacob's information brought swift action from higher authorities, maybe this nightmare would finally end. He waited outside for another 10 minutes, scanning the road, listening for any unnatural sounds. Nothing came. Finally, he stepped back into the house, locked the door, and sank onto the couch. The weight of exhaustion pressed him down, yet his nerves buzzed. He stared at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, refusing to let his guard down fully. An hour passed. then 2. Slowly, the tension in his chest loosened. He drifted into a shallow sleep sometime near dawn, curled uncomfortably on the couch. The next day dawned bright, golden light streaming through the window. Henry woke with a start, stiff from the awkward position. He rubbed his eyes, recalling the events of the night. Jacob was gone, really gone this time, in official custody. A glimmer of hope flickered in Henry's heart. Perhaps that spelled the end of random attacks. He brewed coffee, forced down a bit of toast, and ventured into the yard. The goats greeted him, apparently oblivious to the drama of the evening. He petted them absently, scanning the road. No vehicles, no sign of trouble. Encouraged, he went through his normal chores, checking irrigation channels, feeding livestock, tidying the barn. He resisted the urge to peer over his shoulder every 5 seconds. By mid-morning, a sense of relief washed over him. He even caught himself humming, remembering simpler days. Maybe we're in the clear, he thought. If everything goes right, those men have lost their target for good. Henry's phone hadn't rung yet, so presumably the extraction was successful. Around noon, he decided to drive into town for fresh supplies. The store shelves beckoned with needed items, and part of him wanted a normal outing, free from fear. He climbed into his old pickup, turned onto the dusty lane, and kept watch for any suspicious vehicles. Still, none appeared. Anxiety lingered in the back of his mind, but he pressed on. At the feed store, the clerk asked about the gunfights everyone had heard rumors of. Henry gave a non-committal answer, stating that things had calmed. He loaded up a few sacks of feed, plus extra nails for repairs, wanting to keep his place in good shape. Then he swung by the small grocery for basics. The routine felt grounding. Heading home, Henry flicked on the truck's radio, scanning for local news. Nothing dramatic, just chatter about an upcoming harvest festival. He allowed a small smile. Maybe they were truly free of this. Maybe with Jacob in official hands, the attackers had no reason to linger. He pictured them slinking off to wherever they came from, giving up on a lost cause. But as Henry crested the final rise before his farm, his breath caught. Parked in front of his gate was a single black SUV, glinting ominously under the sun. Heart hammering, he eased off the gas, pulling to the side before the drive. Through the windshield, he saw a lone figure in the driver's seat, leaning forward as if waiting. Henry's first instinct was to back away, but the SUV's door opened too quickly. A figure stepped out, tall and immaculately dressed in a dark suit. Henry recognized him, the same man who'd led that initial search, the one whose cold eyes had promised retribution. He raised a hand in a parody of greeting. Henry braked to a halt, engine idling. Fear and fury flared. He reached for his phone, uncertain whether to call the sheriff or speed away. But the man walked calmly toward him, arms spread to show he held no visible weapon. "Mr. Cole," he called, voice carrying across the dusty road. "I mean you no harm at the moment, I just want to talk." Henry's mind whirled. So they had discovered something. Or perhaps they were making a final attempt to glean Jacob's whereabouts. Gritting his teeth, he killed the engine and cracked open the door. He'd never been a man to shrink from confrontation, but his heart pounded wildly as he climbed out. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here," Henry said, forcing steel into his tone. "After you and your men shot up my barn and threatened me." The man arched an eyebrow, glancing at the bullet holes still evident on the fence. "We've both taken measures we regret," he replied, voice carefully modulated. "I offer a chance to resolve this peacefully." Henry steadied his trembling hands, aware that this might be a trap. "Resolve what? Your target's gone. I don't have Jacob, so there's nothing left for you here." A flicker of annoyance crossed the man's face. "We know he returned to your farm. That can't be denied. My associates nearly caught wind of it." He paused, stepping closer, though not too close. "We also know state authorities intervened. He was taken away last night, wasn't he?" Henry felt his blood run cold. You already know, so why come here? Because I want to be certain he told you nothing damaging, the man said, voice soft as silk. We can't locate him now. He's presumably in protective custody. But if he passed along certain files or knowledge to you, that complicates matters. He gave a tight smile. So I came alone, as a courtesy. If you have no intel to give, we can part ways if you do and you withhold it. His eyes glinted. I can't guarantee your safety. Henry's anger flared. I've told you before, I know nothing about his files or secrets. He squared his shoulders. It's over. He's with the authorities. Your fight is with them, not me. The man studied him, measuring each response. A tension crackled in the hot midday air. Finally, the intruder exhaled. You're either telling the truth, or you're a far better liar than I expected. Either way, I see little point in continuing a scorched earth campaign against you. My superiors, however, might disagree. Henry's pulse jackhammered, though he forced a calm facade. Then your superiors can talk to the law. I'm done being harassed. A faint smile tugged at the man's mouth. We'll see. For now, I'll leave you to your farm. But I caution you, Mr. Cole, if any scraps of Jacob's evidence do end up in your possession, if you contact the press or certain officials beyond Miss Lawson's circle, you'll be drawing us back. Understood? Henry clenched his fists, loud and clear. Now get off my land. The man held his gaze a moment longer, then surprisingly he nodded. I'll go. For now. He turned and walked back to the SUV, moving with a cool confidence. Moments later, the vehicle rumbled away, stirring a cloud of dust. Henry stood there, heart pounding as if he'd run miles. He stayed rooted until the SUV's silhouette vanished down the lane. Then he finally let out a shaking breath, burying his face in his hands. They'd come, but not with a barrage. Rather a direct, chilling threat disguised as a negotiation. He eventually forced himself to climb back into his pickup, driving slowly up to his house. The yard felt eerily quiet, as though the confrontation had cast a pall over everything. Henry parked, pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. Perhaps they truly would let him be, believing he didn't possess anything incriminating. Or perhaps they were biding their time, waiting for him to slip. Stepping onto the porch, he glanced at the phone in his pocket. He should call Lawson and Rutherford, tell them about this encounter. That man's final words reverberated in his mind. We'll see. Shaking off the lingering dread, Henry straightened his shoulders. He might be a simple farmer, but he refused to succumb to intimidation. He would call Lawson, warn her, and stay on guard. If they dared come again, he'd be ready, no matter the cost. Henry stood on his porch for several minutes, rooted in place, the dust still settling in the distance where the black SUV had disappeared. That moment of confrontation replayed again and again in his head. The tall man's cold eyes, his silky threats, the insinuation that Henry's peace depended on staying quiet. A thin layer of sweat clung to Henry's brow and his heartbeat refused to slow. Finally, he pulled out his phone and dialed Agent Lawson. He stepped inside the farmhouse as the line rang, to avoid letting his voice carry across the yard. She answered on the third ring. Lawson here. Henry took a breath, trying to keep his voice steady. Agent, it's Henry Cole again. One of those men just confronted me, came right up to my gate. He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Tell me everything, she said, her tone brisk. Henry relayed the encounter in halting detail, how the man arrived alone, how he demanded to know if Henry had any of Jacob's evidence, how he left after issuing a veiled ultimatum. When Henry finished, Lawson's sigh crackled through the phone. That's consistent with the group's tactics. They pivot to quieter intimidation once direct violence doesn't yield results. Henry sagged against the wall, closing his eyes. Is there anything you can do? I'm worried they'll come back the moment they suspect I'm lying. I'll alert Sheriff Rutherford right away, Lawson replied. We can arrange additional patrols again, But these folks can be elusive. The fact they came openly suggests they're confident. They're testing you, trying to see if they can manipulate you into compliance or silence. Henry swallowed, remembering the man's parting words. For now. They claim they won't bother me as long as I have nothing to share, but if they suspect otherwise, I'm back in the crosshairs. Lawson's tone turned gentle. I understand how frightening that is. Look, we're in the process of moving Jacob to a secure facility. He's already started giving us more detailed statements, naming individuals, companies, and so on. If his information pans out, we'll move quickly. These men might face indictment soon. In the meantime, stay alert. And if you sense any threat, call us. Henry nodded to himself, forcing a weak smile. Thank you, Agent Lawson. I appreciate that. The call ended, leaving him in the quiet farmhouse, the faint hum of the refrigerator accentuating his sudden loneliness. He spent the afternoon wrestling with anxiety, determined to keep his daily routine, but unable to shake the memory of that man's eyes. He tried tending to the goats, fixing a loose board in the tool shed, watering the garden. Every chore felt surreal, as if at any moment he'd turn and see more black suits appearing out of nowhere. By dusk, he couldn't stand the tension alone. He decided to call Frank. The phone rang a while, then a familiar gravelly voice answered. Frank, Henry said in a rush. They showed up again. The one in charge came alone. Threatened me if I knew anything about Jacob's evidence. Lawson says they might be shifting tactics. Frank's sigh drifted over the line. Damn. You all right, Henry? I'm managing, but I'm sick of living in fear. Henry paused, then mustered his courage. Frank, can you come back for a day or two? I could use the backup. Frank didn't hesitate. Of course. I'll drive out tomorrow morning. We'll figure something out. Relief washed through Henry. He thanked Frank and hung up. The house felt a fraction less oppressive now that he knew he'd soon have help. Still, the night ahead stretched ominously. With the men's leader having visited in broad daylight, what might the night hold? He tried to steel himself. He'd weathered shootouts and midnight raids. Maybe tonight would be quiet, a test to see if he'd crumble under the threat. Nonetheless, Henry prepared. He double-checked the lines around the barn, locked every door, and kept the rifle at hand. After a sparse supper, he settled by the living room window, lamp off, scanning the yard. Hours later, nothing stirred except wind in the corn and the faint cry of a distant coyote. He dozed off in his armchair near 3 a.m, jolted awake by the first hints of dawn. Rising stiffly, he stepped onto the porch. The yard lay undisturbed, and he exhaled shakily. Another night survived. Later that morning, Frank's battered sedan appeared in a plume of dust, parking in front of the porch. Henry hurried to greet him. The two men clasped arms, a brief, tight handshake betraying their shared concern. You look awful, Frank said bluntly, eyeing Henry's bloodshot eyes. Couldn't sleep, Henry admitted. Feels like I'm waiting for the next shoe to drop. Frank nodded, retrieving a duffel from the car. Let's head inside. We'll talk strategy. Over coffee, Henry recounted the confrontation in more detail. Frank's expression hardened. He's basically telling you that if you keep your head down, they'll leave you be. But if you step out of line, they'll destroy you. That's classic intimidation. Henry slumped in his chair. I don't want to live under that threat forever, but Lawson says once Jacob's intel pans out, they might dismantle this group. I just have to hold on. Frank sipped his coffee. We can hold on together, at least until we know more from Lawson. If they try another raid, I'm here to help. Henry nodded gratefully. They spent the rest of the day tidying up the farm, as if that small act of order could stave off chaos. Frank tightened lines and repositioned noisemakers. Henry fed the goats, replaced a broken fence post. Neither man mentioned fear directly, but the tension was ever present. Around supper time, Frank cooked a simple stew, and Henry set the table with mismatched plates. They ate in unusual silence, occasionally sharing a glance that asked the same question. Will they come tonight? At dusk, Henry ventured onto the porch while Frank cleaned up. The sky glowed with amber hues, then bled into twilight. Taking in the familiar sight of his land, Henry felt a pang of loss for the normalcy he once knew. He rubbed the back of his neck, remembering the nights he used to sleep unafraid, windows open to the summer breeze. Now even a cricket's chirp could set his nerves on edge. Footsteps on the porch signaled Frank's approach. The bigger man joined Henry, leaning on the railing. Beautiful sunset, he murmured. Hard to believe danger lurks. Henry offered a humorless chuckle. Used to be, the biggest threat was a bad storm flattening my corn. He sighed. I'm sure you faced worse overseas, but for me this is all so alien. Frank nodded. I won't lie. There's a similarity to that underlying tension I felt in combat zones, always waiting for the next strike. But you'll get through this, Henry. Once the authorities crack down on that group, you'll have your life back. Henry wanted to believe him. He let the quiet settle over them, the sunset's glow fading to blue and purple. When full dark arrived, they retreated inside, set up their watch pattern. Frank would stay up until midnight, Henry from midnight onward. Their words were minimal, each man grappling with private anxieties. Just before Frank's shift ended, Henry woke from a half-dream. He stumbled into the living room, blinking in the dim light of a single lamp. Frank stood at the window, rigid. What is it? Henry whispered, instantly on high alert. Frank jerked his chin toward the yard. Look at the fence line. Henry peered out. In the moonlight, he could just make out a figure moving near the same spot where, weeks ago, intruders had attempted to plant devices. A second figure hovered nearby, scanning the yard. Henry's stomach clenched. We have visitors again. Frank's mouth flattened into a tight line. I count 2. Might be more out of sight. They haven't triggered the noisemakers, so they're cautious. Henry reached for the rifle propped against the wall. His hands trembled slightly as he checked it, recalling the taste of fear and adrenaline from previous shootouts. Frank grabbed his sidearm, nodding once to confirm readiness. They eased out the back door, using the house's bulk for cover. The night was eerily still, the crickets' chirps a soft backdrop. Moving stealthily, they slipped along the side of the house, Henry's heart pounding with every step. As they neared the fence, he glimpsed the 2 silhouettes again. They seemed to be examining something on the ground. Perhaps the wire lines or leftover remnants of the earlier devices. Frank gestured with hand signals, indicating he would circle to the right while Henry stayed left. Henry nodded, trying to swallow a surge of panic. This was becoming routine, confronting intruders in the dark. The men at the fence must have sensed a presence. One turned abruptly, raising an object in hand. Henry caught the glint of metal. He and Frank opened their flashlights simultaneously, beams slicing through the darkness. Stop right there, Frank bellowed, weapon leveled. Henry held the rifle at his shoulder, finger near the trigger guard. One intruder cursed. The other flung himself behind a fence post. The muzzle flash of a handgun lit up the night. Henry threw himself sideways as bullets whined past. Chaos erupted in seconds. Frank fired a controlled burst, forcing the attackers to scramble for cover. Henry ducked behind a small shed, heart hammering so fiercely it felt like it might break his ribs. He risked a glance around the corner, saw one figure dart deeper into the cornfield, leaves rustling as he vanished. The second crawled along the ground, firing sporadically at Frank's position. Wood splintered where bullets struck the shed. Wiping sweat from his brow, Henry aimed toward the muzzle flashes, firing twice. He wasn't sure if he hit anything, but the flashes ceased momentarily. Then he heard pounding footsteps, someone retreating. "Frank?" Henry shouted, voice tight. "Over here!" Frank called, emerging from a crouch. They're running! Henry sprinted closer to the fence, scanning the field. He picked up the faint sound of fleeing footsteps, stems snapping as the intruders retreated through the corn. The night fell silent again, save for Henry's ragged breathing. No sign of them circling back. Frank crept forward, eyes scanning the ground, flashlight sweeping the grass. They left something, he muttered, kneeling down. Henry joined him, spotting a metallic device, perhaps a small black box similar to the earlier trackers. Frank picked it up carefully. They were trying to retrieve or plant this, Frank said, tone grim. Looks like we interrupted them again. Henry let out a shaky sigh, lowering his rifle. That's the third or fourth time now. This can't keep happening. Frank stood, device in hand, and nodded. Agreed. We'll call Rutherford. Let him know. See if Lawson wants to examine this new device. Though the intruders had fled, Henry's nerves still hummed with tension. He glanced around, half expecting more men to appear from the corn. Frank guided him back toward the house, flashlight bobbing. Once inside, Henry locked every door and window, then dialed the sheriff's station. A weary deputy answered, promising to dispatch someone at first light. Henry felt a wave of déjà vu, reporting yet another midnight shootout, another find of suspicious tech. He collapsed onto the couch, adrenaline receding, leaving him drained and shaky. Frank placed the recovered device on the table, staring at it as though it might reveal secrets on its own. They're persistent, he said, voice low. Maybe they wanted to confirm Jacob was gone, or maybe they hoped to find evidence he left behind. Either way, they didn't mind risking another gunfight. Henry's hands trembled in his lap. We can't keep this up, Frank. Even you can't stay forever. Lawson can't post a guard here. These men might keep coming until they break me or kill me. Frank pressed his lips together. I know. But we'll keep fighting until something changes, like a major arrest up the chain. At least Jacob's evidence might trigger that soon. Henry hoped so with all his heart. He thought of Jacob, safe, he prayed, in some secure facility, giving the authorities everything they needed to dismantle the conspiracy. If that happened, maybe Henry could return to a life where he didn't flinch at every sound in the dark. Frank smoothed his hair back. Let's stay on watch. Sunrise isn't far. We'll show the deputies what we found, see if it provides a clue. Nodding, Henry forced himself upright. Once again, he and Frank took up positions in the house, watching through windows and listening to the quiet farmland. The hours dragged until dawn. When the first pale light brightened the horizon, Henry felt no relief, only a fresh wave of exhaustion and the daunting knowledge that another day offered no guarantee of safety. Sure enough, not long after sunrise, Sheriff Rutherford and a deputy arrived, stifling yawns. They examined the new device, casting worried looks around. The deputy took photos of the fence post peppered by stray bullets, while Rutherford spoke in hushed tones. Same M.O., Rutherford muttered, shaking his head. They sneak in, you push them back. This standoff can't continue forever. Henry gave a weary nod. We just want them gone, Sheriff. Rutherford rubbed his temples. I've updated Lawson, and she's pressing for a bigger federal presence. But until that comes through, keep your guard up. For what it's worth, I'm impressed you two have held them off this long. Frank snorted. They're not giving us much choice. Rutherford left after an hour, the deputy driving him away with the device bagged as evidence. Henry and Frank exchanged dismayed looks in the dusty yard. The knowledge that they'd again thwarted intruders felt hollow, each small victory overshadowed by the realization that the enemy had more men, more resources, and an unwavering determination. They spent the rest of the day recovering from the long night, taking turns napping so neither would be too exhausted. Henry tried to lose himself in chores. The goats needed their hooves checked, the barn roof had a loose shingle, and weeds crept around the garden. Yet every unexpected noise made him jerk upright, scanning for threats. By early evening, Henry glanced at Frank over a simple meal of warmed-over stew. "How many more nights until something snaps?" he asked quietly, dread churning in his stomach. Frank looked equally grim. "We hold out. If Lawson manages to leverage Jacob's intel, maybe a raid on their base is imminent. That might stop them cold." He set down his spoon. "Look, Henry, no matter what, I'm proud of you for standing by your principles." Henry's throat tightened. He hadn't thought of it in terms of pride, only necessity. "Thanks," he murmured. "I just pray we see peace soon." Night fell once more, and the cycle repeated. Doors locked, lines checked, guns loaded. Henry gazed at his reflection in the living room window, seeing a man aged beyond his years in this short span. Behind him, Frank silently assessed the property, ears tuned for any sign of movement. Would they attack again tonight? Or the next night, or the one after? That uncertainty weighed like an anvil on Henry's spirit. He shut his eyes briefly, longing for the day Jacob's revelations would bring a decisive blow to their pursuers. Until then, he and Frank would endure, standing sentinel under the starlit sky, gripping weapons in weary hands, defending a small patch of land against an enemy that refused to fade. A restless hush fell over the farm on what would turn out to be the final night of Henry Cole's vigil. Sunset arrived in a quiet blaze, staining the sky orange and purple, while Henry and Frank prepared once more for whatever fate might bring. They'd endured days of tension, late-night raids, and ominous threats from the suited men who wanted to silence Jacob's secrets. Yet Jacob was gone, taken into protective custody, and for all Henry knew, the final confrontation was imminent. He and Frank had no clue if or when the attackers would strike again, but the recent pattern suggested they wouldn't simply melt away. As twilight deepened, Henry's stomach twisted with dread. He and Frank settled in the living room, the rifle and sidearm on a nearby table. A single lamp cast long shadows across the floor. Henry poured 2 cups of coffee, bracing for another endless night. Every small noise, the chug of the old refrigerator, the tick of the clock, felt magnified. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees, scanning the windows. Neither man spoke much. They'd long since run out of trivial conversation, and the weight of possibility draped them like a heavy cloak. Around 10 o'clock, the phone rang. Henry's nerves jolted. He snatched the receiver off the hook, heart pounding. "Hello?" "It's Agent Lawson," came the crisp voice. "Got an update. We're moving on some of Jacob's information. The feds are taking interest. We've identified several shell companies, big money moving through them, possibly linked to overseas accounts. It's enough to justify a broader investigation. We've also got a name for the private security outfit, Centurion Management. They've been operating in a legal gray area for years, evidently doing hush-hush tasks for corporations. Good news is, we've got a federal team preparing to make arrests soon." Henry's breath caught. "So there's a real chance you'll shut them down?" "Yes," Lawson said. "I can't share all the details, but if everything lines up, they'll face indictments. Until that happens, though, we suspect Centurion's field operatives might try a final move, something desperate to hide evidence or intimidate key witnesses. Stay vigilant. We're close, but we're not in the clear." Henry thanked her. After hanging up, he relayed the conversation to Frank. A spark of relief lit Frank's eyes, though it quickly dimmed. "Desperate men are dangerous men," he murmured. "They might attempt one last strike. If they think you're a loose end, or that you've got hidden knowledge, they'll come hard." Henry nodded. "We'll be ready." They stoked their determination with that promise of imminent justice. A quiet hour ticked by, each man roused from occasional dozing by the scuff of the wind against the windows. The farm beyond the glass lay in darkness, but the memory of prior attacks kept them rigid with caution. Another hour crawled past. Midnight approached, and Henry rubbed exhausted eyes, stepping onto the porch for a breath of fresh air. The moon hung low, nearly full, bathing the fields in a silver sheen. The cornstalks rustled, reminiscent of hushed voices. He tried to dismiss the idea that something might lurk among them. When he returned inside, Frank stood at the window, posture suddenly tense. "Lights on the road," he said, voice low. "Heading our way." Henry's heart lurched. He flicked off the lamp, plunging the living room into shadow. Together they edged near the window. On the distant dirt road, faint beams glimmered, multiple sets of headlights. Henry recognized the pattern, a staggered convoy. He counted at least 4 vehicles approaching from the county highway, rumbling closer with no sign of stopping. "This is it," Frank breathed. "They're making their final play." Henry grabbed the rifle, mind swirling with panic and resolve. "Lawson said to call if anything happened," he whispered, already pressing the phone to his ear. But before he could dial, the first car in the convoy pulled into his driveway, shining bright beams across the yard. Another followed, then another, black shapes that might well be SUVs. Henry's insides tightened. There was no time to wait. He and Frank positioned themselves near the front windows, weapons ready but not aimed. The vehicles halted in a line, dust swirling in the headlights' glow. Doors opened. Henry heard them slam shut with ominous thuds. Figures stepped forward, silhouettes in neat suits or tactical gear. At least 7 or 8, maybe more. The hush of farmland night had become a standoff once again. A voice rang out, cutting through the beams. "Henry Cole, show yourself!" It was the tall man's voice, the same cold authority that had arrived alone days before. Now he had reinforcements. Henry swallowed hard, adrenaline firing through his limbs. He called back from inside. "What do you want? I told you, I have nothing for you." The man's voice carried a sinister calm. "We need to be absolutely certain. We're finishing this tonight. No more half measures. If you have any info, any documents, you give them to us, or we'll tear this place down until we find them. That's your last chance." Frank shot Henry a grim glance. "We can't let them inside," he muttered, creeping to the porch door. "Should we try scaring them off again?" Henry's mind flashed with images of bullet-riddled walls and blazing barns, but he steadied himself. "They're not going to scare easy," he said softly. "We can hold them back for a while, but there's a dozen of them. Maybe more." Frank nodded, setting his jaw. "We fight if we must, or we stall until Lawson and Rutherford get here." Henry realized the phone was still in his hand. While Frank peered out, Henry hurriedly dialed. It rang once, twice, then Rutherford's voice answered, groggy but alarmed when Henry explained. "Stay put," the sheriff barked. "We'll come with all we've got. Call Lawson, too." Henry fumbled through the next call, hearing the ring. But before Lawson picked up, a volley of gunfire cracked outside, bullets peppering the porch columns. Henry dropped behind the old couch, heart pounding. Frank shouted, returning fire through a window. Splinters flew. Henry heard men yelling outside, and the roar of engines revving to reposition. Lights bobbed as headlights shifted, creating blinding arcs across the interior. Crawling to the phone again, Henry clutched it. "Lawson," she answered, voice urgent. "They're here," he gasped. "A big group, at least 4 vehicles, maybe more. They're shooting. We need help right now." "On our way," Lawson snapped. "Stay low, do what you can." A bullet whizzed past, smashing a lamp. Sparks flew. Henry ducked, forcing himself to remain calm. He heard Frank at the other window, methodically returning fire, each shot a deafening crack. Adrenaline spiked so fiercely that Henry's limbs trembled. He positioned the rifle on the windowsill, aimed at a shape moving behind a vehicle's open door, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil stunned him, but he kept going. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the yard. The attackers advanced in a coordinated push, 2 flanking the barn, others rushing the fence. Henry glimpsed the tall man crouched behind a hood, barking orders. The crunch of shattered glass and the stench of gunpowder overwhelmed the house. One bullet tore through the wall near Henry's shoulder, embedding in the wood with a solid thunk. He pressed his cheek to the rifle's stock, fired again. A distant shout indicated he might have hit someone. Fear and fury churned in him. Frank's calm instructions cut through the chaos. "Henry, shift left. They're trying to come around your blind spot." Henry complied, rolling behind an overturned table. Sure enough, 2 figures sprinted across open ground toward the side of the house. Henry squeezed off rounds, forcing them to dive behind a water trough. Minutes felt like hours. Henry's ears rang from the gunfire and sweat stung his eyes. The attackers peppered the house with bullets, each impact driving fresh terror into Henry's heart. He prayed for the sheriff, for Lawson, anyone. The siege threatened to consume them. Still, he and Frank refused to yield, hunkering down behind makeshift cover. Suddenly, a thunderous blast shook the yard, a small explosion, sending shards of wood from the barn's direction. Henry froze in horror. Had they rigged explosives as they once threatened? Fear twisted his insides. The goats bleated frantically. Frank cursed. "They're breaching the barn." He darted from the window, crossing the living room. Henry followed, scrambling, though bullets shattered more glass behind them. Through the back door's window, they saw flames licking up the barn wall, bright tongues of fire casting wild shadows across the yard. 1 or 2 figures dashed away, apparently the ones who'd ignited the blaze. "No!" Henry cried, heart twisting at the sight. The barn, a staple of his family's farm for generations, now flickered with deadly flames. Smoke billowed, swirling in the headlights. Frank grabbed Henry's arm, stopping him from rushing outside. "It's suicide to charge out," Frank shouted over the roar of flames and gunfire. "They'll pick us off. We have to hold here." Henry's eyes burned with grief and rage. The barn roof was catching quickly, dry wood and old straw fueling the blaze. In seconds it might collapse, and once that was done, the attackers might press in on the house. Tearing free from Frank's grasp, Henry raised his rifle again. He spotted a figure near the barn, likely the one who'd set the charge, and fired. The figure crumpled. A surge of grim satisfaction coursed through Henry. He loathed violence, but these men were killing his livelihood. Frank pinned another attacker behind a vehicle, methodically picking at him with short bursts. But the tall man's voice carried over the inferno. "Henry Cole, last warning. Surrender what you have or watch everything burn." Henry set his jaw, tears pricking his eyes at the barn's destruction. "I have nothing," he shouted hoarsely. "You're wasting your time." More bullets hammered the house. Frank ducked, biting back a curse. "They don't believe you," he hissed, "or they're just punishing you out of spite." Then, as if in answer to a prayer, sirens cut through the night. A chorus of them, multiple vehicles roaring up the road. Henry's heart leapt. Sheriff Rutherford must have arrived with backups. Maybe Lawson, too. Searchlights suddenly split the darkness from the far side of the yard. Henry glimpsed the attackers' silhouettes swiveling in confusion. An amplified voice boomed, "This is the county sheriff. Drop your weapons and stand down." Several floodlights pinned the men in suits, making them scramble for cover. Henry and Frank seized the moment, firing a flurry of shots to pin them down. The yard erupted in a chaotic standoff, law enforcement vehicles sliding to a halt. Doors flung open, and deputies advanced in bulletproof vests. Henry heard Rutherford's voice among them. Another wave of sirens signaled more arrivals. The tall man bellowed for his group to pull back. Some complied, retreating behind their SUVs, but deputies flanked them swiftly. Gunshots echoed from every angle. Henry crouched by the living room window, heart pounding as the tide of the battle seemed to shift. He could see uniformed figures pressing forward, the flicker of red and blue lights mingling with the barn fire's orange glow. For one sickening moment, Henry worried the attackers might choose to fight to the last. Then he saw 2 or 3 raise their hands, dropping guns on the ground. Others tried to run, only to be tackled by deputies. The tall man sprinted for the nearest SUV, but a flash of movement signaled he was tackled as well, skidding in the dirt. Henry and Frank stared at each other. disbelieving. Henry fumbled with the door lock, stepping outside with rifle lowered, smoke stinging his eyes. The barn still raged with flames, though a fire truck's siren wailed in the distance. Deputies in black Kevlar descended on the attackers, zip-tying wrists and shouting commands. Among the chaos, Henry spotted Agent Lawson climbing from a federal SUV. Her face shone with grim satisfaction. She rushed to Henry's side, hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" "We saw the barn, my God." Henry's throat was too tight for words. He nodded, pressing a hand to his chest, tears threatened by relief and heartbreak. Frank emerged behind him, coughing at the smoke. Deputies corralled the subdued attackers. The tall man was among them, face twisted in rage. He stared daggers at Henry, but the law pinned him, forcing his arms behind his back. The scene was surreal, swirling lights, urgent shouts, the barn consumed in roaring flames. Henry glimpsed Rutherford coordinating with firefighters who arrived moments later, hoses uncoiling to douse the inferno. Lawson gave Henry a swift nod. "Jacob's testimony pinned a good portion of their operation. We combined that with your local intel, got permission for a takedown operation. Guess they tried to strike first, but we came in force." Henry sagged with relief, tears finally sliding down his soot-stained cheeks. He thought of how close he'd come to losing everything. In truth, the barn might still be lost, its timbers collapsing in a shower of sparks. But he was alive, and those who had terrorized him were pinned to the ground or slumped against patrol cars. Frank wrapped an arm around Henry's shoulder in silent support. "You did it," he murmured, voice thick. "We did it. They're done now." Henry watched the flames devour what had once been the core of his family's farm, sorrow stabbing his heart. Still, in that same breath, he felt a powerful surge of gratitude. No more nights of fear, no more men in suits prowling his fields. The final confrontation was over, and with it perhaps a new dawn awaited. And as dawn indeed broke, painting the sky in a tender pink, the last embers of the barn sputtered under the firefighters' spray. Soot-covered and exhausted, Henry stood with Frank, Agent Lawson, and Sheriff Rutherford, watching the collapsed roof smolder. The air smelled of charred wood and gunpowder, a testament to the battle they had survived. Tears lined Henry's cheeks, but a fragile smile touched his lips. "I can rebuild," he whispered, voice hoarse. "The land's still here. I'm still here." Lawson rested a hand on his arm. "We'll do everything possible to bring them to justice, Mr. Cole. You've done more than anyone could ask." Henry nodded, shoulders trembling with the enormity of relief, grief, and triumph. The sun's first rays glistened on the dew-soaked grass, illuminating the battered farmhouse, bullet-scarred and scorched, but still standing. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Henry dared to hope that the old place, and his life, would finally be at peace.